Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The flicker of movement caught my eye as I was taking out the trash, a shadow darting between the trees at the edge of my property. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the fading light of dusk played tricks on my eyes. Probably just a deer, I told myself, shaking off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. Little did I know, that fleeting moment would be the first thread in unraveling a terrifying conspiracy that had taken root right next door. I'd always considered myself a pretty observant person. You don't spend 15 years as a journalist without developing a keen eye for detail. But somehow, I'd missed the signs that something was very wrong in my quiet suburban neighborhood. It started small. A moving truck in the driveway next door one sunny Saturday morning. I watched from behind my curtains as a man in his mid-40s supervised the unloading of boxes and furniture. He caught me looking and waved with a friendly smile. I waved back, relieved. After old Mrs. Johnson passed away, I'd been worried about who might move in. This guy seemed normal enough. I baked a plate of welcome cookies and headed over to introduce myself. The door opened before I could knock, and I found myself face to face with my new neighbor. "Hi there," I said, plastering on my best friendly smile. "I'm Sarah from next door. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." He looked at the cookies, then back at me, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said curtly, taking the plate. "I'm Tom." Without another word, he shut the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, taken aback by his abruptness. So much for Southern hospitality, I thought as I walked back home. But I brushed it off. Moving is stressful after all. I'm sure he'd warm up once he settled in. Weeks passed, and Tom remained a mystery. He kept odd hours, coming and going at all times of the day and night. I rarely saw him during daylight, but often heard his car pulling in well after midnight. The lights in his house would flicker on and off at strange intervals, sometimes staying on all night. One evening, as I was watering my flower beds, I noticed Tom carrying a large duffel bag from his car to the garage. Nothing too strange about that, except for the way he kept looking over his shoulder, as if afraid someone might see. Our eyes met briefly, and he quickly looked away, hurrying inside. My journalistic instincts began to tingle. Something wasn't right here. I started paying closer attention, jotting down Tom's comings and goings in a little notebook. Call it nosy if you want, but years of chasing stories had taught me to trust my gut, and my gut was screaming that there was more to Tom than met the eye. One night, unable to sleep, I noticed a flurry of activity next door. Cars I didn't recognize pulled up, their headlights off. Shadowy figures moved back and forth between the vehicles and Tom's garage. I crept to my window, straining to see in the darkness. The figures were carrying more duffel bags, some so heavy it took two people to lift them. My heart raced. Was I witnessing some kind of drug operation? Should I call the police? But what if I was wrong? I had no proof, just suspicions and a few scribbled notes. I decided to wait, to gather more evidence before potentially ruining someone's life over what could be a misunderstanding. Days passed, and the activity next door intensified. More late-night visitors, more hushed conversations I could barely hear through my open window. I began to feel like I was living next to a hornet's nest, never knowing when it might explode. Then came the night that changed everything. It was well past midnight, and I was up late working on an article. A sound from outside caught my attention, a metallic scraping, followed by a dull thud. I peered out my window and saw Tom dragging something heavy towards his garage. In the moonlight, I could just make out the shape of what looked like a large gun case. My blood ran cold. This was no drug operation. This was something far worse. With shaking hands, I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, a thought struck me. What if they didn't believe me? What if Tom got rid of the evidence before they arrived? I needed proof. In that moment, I made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both. I slipped on my shoes and crept out my back door, making my way towards Tom's garage. The night was eerily quiet, every snapping twig under my feet sounding like a gunshot. I reached the side of the garage and pressed my ear against the wall, listening. Muffled voices drifted through the thin walls. I couldn't make out exact words, but the tone was urgent, almost angry. Then, silence. I held my breath, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps moving away, followed by the sound of a door closing. This was my chance. With trembling fingers, I tried the garage door. Locked, of course. But wait, there was a small window near the roof, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. And conveniently, Tom had left a ladder propped against the side of the garage. I climbed as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure Tom would hear it from inside his house. When I reached the window, I said a silent prayer of thanks to find it unlocked. Carefully, I eased it open and slipped inside, landing as softly as I could on the concrete floor. I pulled out my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space around me. What I saw made my blood run cold. The garage was filled with weapons. Guns of all sizes lined the walls, from small handguns to what looked like military-grade assault rifles. Boxes of ammunition were stacked in corners. But it was what I saw on a table in the center of the room that truly terrified me. Maps. Detailed maps of our town, with certain buildings circled in red. The police station, the courthouse, the mall, and disturbingly, the elementary school. My hands shook as I snapped pictures with my phone, trying to document everything I saw. This wasn't just a weapons cache. This was the planning stages of an attack. A creak from outside froze me in place. Footsteps approached the garage door. I frantically looked around for a place to hide, but the space was too open, too exposed. The door began to open. In a moment of panic-induced clarity, I dove behind a stack of boxes, curling into as small a ball as I could manage. I held my breath, praying that whoever was entering wouldn't look too closely in my direction. The lights flicked on, momentarily blinding me. Through a gap in the boxes, I could see Tom enter, followed by two men I didn't recognize. They moved to the table with the maps, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Everything's in place," Tom was saying. "We move tomorrow at noon. The others are ready." My mind raced. Tomorrow, noon. I had to do something. Had to stop this before it was too late. As if in answer to my desperate thoughts, my phone chose that moment to vibrate loudly in my pocket. An incoming call. The conversation stopped abruptly. "What was that?" one of the men asked sharply. I closed my eyes, silently cursing myself for not putting my phone on silent. This was it. I was going to die here, in this garage full of weapons meant to hurt who knows how many innocent people. Footsteps approached my hiding spot. I curled tighter, as if I could somehow make myself invisible through sheer force of will. The boxes were shoved aside, and I found myself staring up at Tom and his companions. Their faces were masks of rage and surprise. "Well, well," Tom said, his voice dangerously calm. "Looks like we have a little spy in our midst." One of the other men reached down and roughly pulled me to my feet. "What should we do with her?" he asked Tom. Tom studied me for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. I stared back, trying to keep the fear from showing on my face. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. "We can't let her go," the third man said. "She's seen too much." Tom nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't risk it." He turned to the man holding me. "Take her inside. We'll deal with her after we finish our preparations." As they dragged me towards the house, a sudden, desperate idea struck me. It was risky, but it was my only chance. "Wait," I shouted. "You don't want to do this." Tom paused, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, and why is that?" I took a deep breath, praying my bluff would work. Because I've already sent everything I found to my editor. If anything happens to me, it all goes public. The men exchanged worried glances. I pressed on, my voice steadier than I felt. But if you let me go now, I might be persuaded to hold the story, at least long enough for you to reconsider your plans. It was a gamble, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought they wouldn't buy it. But then Tom's shoulders sagged slightly, and I knew I had won. Fine, he spat. Get out of here. But if I see one word about this in the news... He didn't need to finish the threat. I nodded quickly and backed away, not daring to turn my back on them until I was safely out of the garage. Once outside, I ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping until I was locked safely in my house. With shaking hands, I dialed 911, praying it wasn't too late to stop whatever Tom and his accomplices had planned. The next few hours were a blur of police sirens, questioning, and frantic phone calls to my editor. By dawn, Tom and his conspirators were in custody, their plot foiled before it could claim any innocent lives. As I watched the sun rise over my quiet suburban street, now bustling with police activity, I marveled at how close we had come to tragedy. And I silently vowed to never again ignore that little voice of suspicion, no matter how implausible it might seem. Because sometimes, the most dangerous threats are hiding right next door, in plain sight. The first arrow appeared on day 2 of my solo camping trip, carved deep into the bark of an old oak. Its crude shape pointed directly at my tent. I dismissed it as a coincidence, a marker left by some previous hiker perhaps. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across my campsite, a nagging sense of unease settled in my gut. Little did I know, this simple marking was the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the very edge of survival. I've always been a bit of a loner, preferring the quiet solitude of nature to the chaos of city life. That's why I decided to take a week off work and head deep into the Adirondacks for some much-needed peace and reflection. The first day was everything I'd hoped for: crisp mountain air, the soothing sounds of a nearby stream, and not another soul in sight. But then came that arrow. I tried to shake off my paranoia as I prepared dinner over my small campfire. The woods play tricks on your mind when you're alone, I told myself. Still, I found my eyes drawn to that crude carving, its direction unmistakable in the flickering firelight. Sleep came fitfully that night, my dreams filled with shadowy figures moving just beyond the glow of my dying fire. I woke with the dawn, groggy and unsettled. As I emerged from my tent, stretching in the cool morning air, my blood ran cold. There, on a tree directly across from the first, was another arrow. This one fresher, the pale wood exposed by the carving stark against the dark bark. It, too, pointed unwaveringly at my tent. My heart raced as I spun in a slow circle, scanning the trees surrounding my small clearing. How had I not heard someone approach in the night? And why would they do this? I debated packing up and heading back to civilization right then and there, but a stubborn part of me refused to let some childish prank ruin my vacation. Besides, I reasoned, I was probably miles from the nearest trail. Leaving now would mean navigating unfamiliar terrain as the day grew hotter. So I stayed, but my relaxing getaway had transformed into a tense vigil. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, searching for what? I wasn't sure, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As night fell, I built my fire higher than usual, finding comfort in its warm circle of light. I left my flashlight on in the tent, creating the illusion that I might be inside. In reality, I sat with my back against a large boulder, a hefty branch clutched in my white-knuckled grip. The hours crept by, the forest eerily silent save for the occasional hoot of a distant owl. My eyelids grew heavy, the strain of constant vigilance taking its toll. Just as I felt myself beginning to drift off, a sharp crack jolted me fully awake. It came from the direction of my tent. I held my breath, straining my ears. There, another sound, softer this time. The unmistakable crunch of leaves under a careful footstep. Someone was in my camp. I clutched my makeshift weapon tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. A shadow moved at the edge of the firelight, too large and deliberate to be an animal. I opened my mouth to shout, to confront whoever was out there, but fear closed my throat. The shadow paused by my tent, and I saw a hand reach out to touch the fabric. Even from this distance, I could see that the fingers were unnaturally long and thin. I must have made a sound, a whimper of terror perhaps, because the figure suddenly turned in my direction. For a heart-stopping moment, I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the firelight, glowing like embers in the darkness. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows beyond my camp with inhuman speed. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping my vigil until the first rays of dawn began to lighten the sky. As soon as it was light enough to see, I began to pack up my gear with shaking hands. Prank or no prank, I'd had enough. It was time to go home. But the forest had other plans. As I shouldered my heavy backpack and prepared to leave, my eyes fell on a new marking. This time, it wasn't an arrow, but a single word carved into the trunk of the nearest tree. Stay. Ice flooded my veins. This was no longer just creepy, it was threatening. I turned to flee down the narrow trail that had led me to this cursed campsite, only to stumble to a halt after a few steps. There, blocking my path, stood a crude figure fashioned from sticks and vine. It was easily 7 feet tall, its proportions all wrong, arms too long, legs bent at unnatural angles. Worst of all was the head, a gnarled piece of wood with deep gouges where eyes should be. I backpedaled, my breath coming in short gasps. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life. I was dreaming, hallucinating. Anything but facing some Blair Witch nightmare in the middle of nowhere. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled, half expecting to see another stick figure. Instead, my eyes fell on a new arrow carved into a tree. This one pointed deeper into the woods, away from the trail and my only route back to civilization. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind a maelstrom of panic and indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But which way? The trail was blocked by that terrifying effigy, and who knew what might be lurking in the depths of the uncharted forest? In the end, blind terror won out. I plunged into the woods, following the arrow's direction simply because it was away from that thing on the trail. Branches whipped at my face as I ran, roots seeming to reach up to tangle my feet. But I didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. The feeling of eyes on my back drove me ever forward. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in that green maze. My lungs burned, my legs trembled with exhaustion, but still I pushed on. It wasn't until I burst through a thick stand of pines into a small clearing that I finally allowed myself to stop. Doubled over, hands on my knees, I gulped in air like a drowning man. As my pulse slowly returned to normal, I began to take stock of my surroundings. The clearing was unremarkable, just a patch of grass and wildflowers surrounded by dense forest. But there, on the far side, was another arrow. My legs nearly gave out as a wave of despair washed over me. How long could this go on? How far would I be led into this wilderness, and to what end? With no other choice, I followed the new arrow, and the next after that. Each one drove me deeper into the forest, further from any hope of rescue. The terrain grew rougher, the underbrush thicker. More than once I considered trying to double back, to find the trail I'd abandoned in my panic. But every time I paused, every time I even thought about changing course, I'd hear something moving in the forest behind me. Soft footsteps, the rustle of leaves, always just on the edge of perception. As the day wore on, My fear began to mingle with anger. Who was doing this? What did they want from me? The next time I found an arrow, I screamed my frustration into the uncaring forest. What do you want? Why are you doing this? Only silence answered, broken by the mocking call of a distant bird. Exhausted, both physically and emotionally, I slumped against a tree. I couldn't go on like this. I needed to rest, to think, to come up with some kind of plan. As the adrenaline faded, I became aware of just how thirsty I was. In my mad flight, I'd left most of my gear back at the campsite, including my water bottle. A new fear gripped me. I was lost in the wilderness with no supplies, no water, and no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. Even if I evaded whatever was stalking me through these woods, how long could I survive out here? As if in answer to my desperate thoughts, I heard the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I stumbled towards the sound, pushing through a dense thicket of brambles that left my arms scratched and bleeding. I emerged onto the bank of a small, swift-running stream. The sight of clean, clear water was like a miracle. I fell to my knees at the edge, cupping my hands to bring the cool liquid to my parched lips. As I drank, I felt some of my strength returning, my mind clearing. That's when I saw it. Half hidden by the tall grass on the opposite bank was another stick figure. This one was smaller than the first, but no less unsettling. It seemed to stare at me with its eyeless face, a silent sentry. I scrambled backwards, nearly falling in my haste to put distance between myself and that nightmarish creation. As I did, my heel caught on something half buried in the soft earth of the bank. I looked down, expecting a rock or tree root. Instead, I found myself staring at a human skull. A scream tore from my throat as I threw myself away from the grisly discovery. But everywhere I turned, I saw more bones poking up through the dirt and leaves. This wasn't just a campsite or a trail, it was a graveyard. Frantic, I splashed across the shallow stream, no longer caring about the noise I made or the trail I left. I had to get out of there, had to find my way back to the real world where such horrors couldn't exist. As I climbed the opposite bank, my foot slipped on the wet stones. I fell hard. The wind knocked out of me. Dazed, I rolled onto my back, staring up at the canopy of leaves above. That's when I saw them. Faces, dozens of them, watching me from the branches overhead. Pale, elongated features, eyes dark and hungry. As my vision blurred and darkness crept in at the edges, I saw them begin to descend, moving with that same uncanny speed I'd glimpsed back at my camp. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was a sense of resignation. The forest had won. I was never leaving these woods, never going home. Like the bones by the stream, I would become just another sacrifice to whatever hungry gods ruled this dark place. And somewhere in the distance, a bird called out one final time, its cry sounding almost like laughter. The scent of grease and desperation clung to me as I climbed the stairs of the run-down apartment complex. It was my last delivery of the night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway, or the eerie silence that seemed to swallow every footstep. Whatever it was, my instincts were screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I needed this job, and one more delivery meant one more tip. I had no idea that knocking on that door would plunge me into a nightmare I might never escape. I've been a delivery driver for Tasty Bites for about 6 months now. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, mostly. Tonight had been slow, and I was hoping this last order would make up for it. The address was in a part of town I rarely visited, all crumbling brick buildings and shadowy alleyways. As I reached the door of apartment 4C, I took a deep breath and plastered on my best, "Please tip me," smile. I knocked, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet hallway. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Tasty Bites delivery," I called out, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. It was late, and I just wanted to go home. Finally, I heard movement inside. The door opened a crack, and a man's face appeared. He looked nervous, his eyes darting up and down the hallway before settling on me. "You got the food?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I held up the bag. "Yep, one large pepperoni and a side of wings. That'll be $24.50. He nodded and opened the door wider, gesturing for me to come in. "Cash is on the table inside. Come on, hurry up." Warning bells went off in my head. We're not supposed to enter customers' homes. It's a safety thing. But before I could protest, the man grabbed my arm and pulled me inside, quickly shutting the door behind us. The apartment was dimly lit and smelled of stale cigarettes. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I realized we weren't alone. 3 other men were in the room, all looking as nervous as the one who'd answered the door. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I just need to drop off the food and—" "Shut up," one of the men snapped. He was tall and muscular, with a tattoo snaking up his neck. "You picked a bad night to make a delivery, kid." My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they could hear it. I clutched the food bag like a shield, as if somehow a pepperoni pizza could protect me from whatever was happening. The man who'd answered the door handed me a wad of cash. "Here's for the food. Now sit down and keep quiet." I sank into a threadbare armchair, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. The 4 men huddled together, speaking in low, urgent tones. I caught snippets of their conversation. Shipment, buyers, cops. Oh God, I'd walked right into the middle of a drug deal. I tried to steady my breathing, to think rationally. Maybe if I just stayed quiet and didn't cause any trouble, they'd let me go once their business was done. I glanced at the door, wondering if I could make a run for it. As if reading my thoughts, the tattooed man turned to me. "Don't even think about it," he growled. "You try to leave and you won't make it down the hallway." I nodded, swallowing hard. The minutes ticked by like hours. The men continued their hushed conversation, occasionally glancing at me with a mix of annoyance and suspicion. I sat frozen in the chair, afraid that even the slightest movement might set them off. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. Everyone in the room tensed. "That's them," one of the men whispered. "Get ready." The tattooed man pointed at me. "You, in the bathroom. Now. And if you make a sound, I swear to God." He didn't need to finish the threat. I scurried into the tiny bathroom, my heart in my throat. The door closed behind me, and I heard the click of a lock. Trapped. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear what was happening. More voices, the sound of heavy objects being moved. Then, without warning, a deafening crash. "Police! Everybody down!" The apartment erupted into chaos. Shouts, the sound of furniture being overturned, running footsteps, and then, terrifyingly close, gunshots. I stumbled away from the door, my back hitting the grimy bathtub. This couldn't be happening. Less than an hour ago, I was worried about making rent. Now I was caught in the crossfire of a drug bust. The noise outside the bathroom died down, replaced by the crackle of police radios and the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. I sank to the floor, my whole body shaking. What now? Would the police think I was part of this? Would they believe I was just a delivery driver in the wrong place at the wrong time? Minutes passed, feeling like an eternity. Then, a knock on the bathroom door. "This is the police. Is anyone in there?" I cleared my throat, surprised to find my voice still worked. Yes. I'm in here. I'm not armed. I'm just the delivery guy." There was a pause, then the sound of a key in the lock. The door swung open, revealing a stern-faced officer with his gun drawn. His eyes widened slightly as he took in my Tasty Bites uniform and the crumpled food bag still clutched in my hand. "Come out slowly. Hands where I can see them," he instructed. I did as I was told. my legs wobbly as I stepped into the living room. It looked like a war zone. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. The four men from earlier were face down on the floor, hands cuffed behind their backs. And there, on the coffee table, was an open duffel bag filled with what I could only assume were drugs. The officer who'd found me in the bathroom turned to his partner. "We've got a civilian here. Says he's a delivery driver." The other cop raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? Talk about bad timing, kid." I nodded weakly. I didn't know. They pulled me inside when I tried to deliver the food. I swear, I had nothing to do with any of this. The next few hours were a blur. I was questioned extensively by the police, first at the apartment and then down at the station. I told my story over and over, showing them my work ID, the order details on my phone, anything to prove I was just an innocent bystander. Finally, after what felt like days, they seemed to believe me. "Looks like you really were just in the wrong place at the wrong time," the detective said, shaking his head. "You're free to go, but we may need to contact you again for further questioning." I stumbled out of the police station into the harsh light of early morning. My phone was dead, my car was still parked outside that cursed apartment building, and I had missed an entire night's worth of deliveries, but I was alive, and I wasn't under arrest. It felt like a miracle. As I waited for a cab to take me to my car, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The fear, the confusion, the sheer absurdity of it all. I thought about how close I'd come to real danger, how easily things could have gone terribly wrong. The cab pulled up, and as I climbed in, I made a decision. No more night shifts, no more deliveries to sketchy neighborhoods. Hell, maybe no more delivery driving at all. Life was too short, and apparently, too unpredictable. "Where to?" the cab driver asked. I gave him the address of the apartment building, then leaned back in the seat, suddenly exhausted. As we drove through the awakening city, I found myself looking at every building, every person, with new eyes. How many secrets were hidden behind those walls? How many lives were balanced on a knife's edge, one chance encounter away from disaster? When we arrived at my car, I thanked the driver and paid him with the last of the cash in my wallet. Ironically, the money I'd been given for the ill-fated pizza delivery. As I unlocked my car, I noticed something on the passenger seat, the Tasty Bites hat I always wore on deliveries. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Then, with a decisive motion, I tossed it into a nearby trash can. It was time for a change. As I drove home, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, certainly, at how close I'd come to real danger. Relief that I'd made it out unscathed. But also, oddly, a sense of exhilaration. I had faced the unknown and survived. I had a story to tell, though I doubted anyone would believe it. One thing was certain: I would never look at a late-night food delivery the same way again. And somewhere out there, 4 criminals were probably wondering why the hell they'd ordered a pizza in the middle of a drug deal. Life, I realized, was a lot like that delivery. You never really know what's waiting on the other side of the door. All you can do is knock and hope for the best. The crackle of the fireplace should have been soothing, but instead, it only amplified the silence that hung heavy between us. I glanced at my wife, Sarah, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, and wondered for the 100th time if this getaway was a mistake. We'd come to this remote cabin to reconnect, to save our crumbling marriage. But as I opened my mouth to break the awkward silence, a sound from outside made us both freeze. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping under a heavy foot. And then another. We weren't alone. I'd found the cabin online, advertised as a rustic retreat for couples looking to escape the world. It seemed perfect. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just us and nature. A chance to remember why we fell in love in the first place, before careers and stress, and 1,000 tiny resentments had driven a wedge between us. The first day had been tense but hopeful. We'd hiked in the surrounding woods, cooked dinner together, even shared a bottle of wine by the fire. There were moments when I caught a glimpse of the old Sarah, the one who used to laugh at my terrible jokes and look at me like I was her whole world. But as night fell on our second day, the silence had returned. We sat in the living room, each lost in our own thoughts, when that sound jolted us back to the present. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, standing up slowly. "Probably just an animal. I'll check it out." I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the clearing where our cabin stood. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a movement at the edge of the trees caught my eye. A figure, definitely human, darting between the shadows. My heart began to race. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I need you to go to the bedroom and lock the door. Now." "What? Why? What did you see?" The fear in her voice was palpable. "Just go, please. I'll explain in a minute." For once, she didn't argue. I heard her quick footsteps retreating down the hall, followed by the click of the lock. I turned back to the window, scanning the tree line. There, another flash of movement. This time, I caught a glimpse of a face, pale in the moonlight, eyes locked on the cabin, and he wasn't alone. I could make out at least 2 other shapes moving in the darkness. My mind raced. What did they want? Were they just hikers who had lost their way? But something in my gut told me this was far more sinister. I moved quickly through the cabin, checking every door and window. Most were already locked, but I added chairs under the doorknobs for good measure. As I worked, I heard more sounds from outside, hushed voices, the crunch of leaves under careful footsteps. They were surrounding us. I grabbed a fireplace poker, the closest thing to a weapon I could find, and made my way to the bedroom. Sarah's face was pale as she opened the door. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath. "There are people outside. I don't know what they want, but they're trying to get in. We need to find a way out of here." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed with determination. In that moment, I saw a flash of the strong, capable woman I'd fallen in love with. "What's the plan?" she asked. Before I could answer, a loud crash echoed through the cabin. They were breaking in. "Bathroom!" I hissed, grabbing Sarah's hand. We ran into the small ensuite, locking the flimsy door behind us. It wouldn't hold them for long, but it might buy us some time. Sarah was already at the small window, trying to pry it open. "It's stuck," she grunted, pulling with all her might. I joined her, adding my strength to hers. With a groan of protesting wood, the window finally gave way. Cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and danger. The sound of heavy footsteps in the bedroom made us both freeze. They were inside. "You go first," I whispered to Sarah. "I'll be right behind you." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. With a grace I'd forgotten she possessed, she hoisted herself up and through the narrow opening. I passed her the fireplace poker before following, my larger frame making the escape far less elegant. As my feet hit the ground, I heard the bathroom door splinter. We'd made it out just in time. "Run!" I gasped, grabbing Sarah's hand once more. We plunged into the darkness of the surrounding forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots seeming to reach up to trip us. Behind us, angry shouts erupted from the cabin. We ran blindly, with no idea where we were going. The forest was a maze of shadows and hidden obstacles. More than once, we stumbled, but each time we pulled each other back up, driven by pure adrenaline and the terrifying sounds of pursuit. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sarah tugged me to a stop. "Wait," she panted. "Listen." I strained my ears, trying to hear past the pounding of my own heart. The forest was eerily quiet. No shouts, no crashing footsteps. Had we lost them? "We need to find somewhere to hide," Sarah whispered. "We can't keep running forever." She was right. We were both exhausted, and in our panic, we'd run deeper into unfamiliar territory. I scanned our surroundings, looking for anything that might offer shelter. That's when I saw it, a dark shape looming against the starry sky. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it was an old barn, its weathered boards silvery in the moonlight. "There," I pointed. "Maybe we can hide inside until morning." We approached cautiously, alert for any sign of our pursuers. The barn door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet night. Inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of old hay and abandoned dreams. We found a spot behind some old farm equipment, huddling close together in the darkness. For the first time since this nightmare began, we had a moment to breathe. "Who are they?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do they want?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but we're going to get out of this, together." She squeezed my hand, and I felt a rush of emotion. Despite everything, our problems, our fights, the distance that had grown between us, in this moment, we were united. We were a team again. A sound outside made us both tense. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching the barn. We held our breath, pressing ourselves deeper into the shadows. The door creaked open. A beam of light cut through the darkness, a flashlight. It swept across the barn's interior, searching. I could make out a silhouette in the doorway, bulky and menacing. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. I knew we had a choice to make. Stay hidden and hope they didn't find us, or make a break for it. Either way was a gamble with our lives. The flashlight beam crept closer to our hiding spot. In that moment, I made a decision. "When I say go," I breathed into Sarah's ear, "run for the door. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run." She nodded, her body coiled with tension. The light was almost upon us. I could hear the intruders breathing, smell the acrid scent of cigarette smoke. "Now!" I shouted, leaping up and charging straight at our attacker. The element of surprise worked in my favor. He stumbled back, the flashlight falling from his grasp. I heard Sarah's footsteps as she sprinted for the door. I grappled with the man, my only goal to buy Sarah enough time to escape. We crashed into a stack of old crates, wood splintering around us. He was strong, but desperation lent me strength I didn't know I possessed. Suddenly, a searing pain exploded in my side. He'd pulled a knife. I stumbled back, clutching at the wound, warm blood seeping between my fingers. "John!" Sarah's scream cut through the chaos. She was at the door, silhouetted against the night sky. She hadn't run. The man turned towards her voice, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening I needed. I lunged forward, driving my shoulder into his midsection. We both went down hard. "Run!" I yelled at Sarah. "Go get help!" This time, she listened. I heard her footsteps fading into the night as I struggled with my attacker. Despite the pain in my side, I managed to pin him down, my forearm pressed against his throat. "Who are you?" I demanded. "What do you want from us?" He laughed, a chilling sound. "Wrong place, wrong time, city boy. This is our territory. We don't like outsiders." Before I could process his words, a sharp blow to the back of my head sent me sprawling. Stars exploded behind my eyes as I hit the ground. Through the haze of pain, I saw two more figures enter the barn. "Took you long enough," my attacker grumbled, getting to his feet. I tried to stand, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the glint of moonlight on a raised blade. I woke to the sound of sirens and the feel of gentle hands on my face. I blinked, the world slowly coming into focus. Sarah's tear-stained face hovered above me, a relieved smile breaking through her worry. "You're okay," she sobbed. I thought I'd lost you." As consciousness fully returned, So did the pain. But along with it came a flood of relief. We'd survived. Somehow, against all odds, we'd made it through the night. I later learned that Sarah had managed to flag down a passing car on the main road. The police arrived just in time, catching our attackers as they tried to flee the scene. They were locals, part of a gang that terrorized vacationers for thrills and petty theft. We'd been their latest targets, chosen simply because we were there. As I recovered in the hospital, Sarah never left my side. We talked, really talked, for the first time in years, about our fears, our regrets, our hopes for the future. The nightmare we'd endured had stripped away all the trivial things that had come between us, leaving only what truly mattered. We didn't save our marriage that weekend, but we did rediscover the foundation it was built on: trust, courage, and a love strong enough to face down the darkest night. As I held Sarah's hand, watching the sun rise through the hospital window, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Sometimes it takes staring into the abyss to remember what you're fighting for. The neon signs flickered like dying fireflies, casting an eerie glow over the rain-slicked streets. I pulled my jacket tighter, cursing myself for staying at the office so late. The shortcut through Madsen Alley had always made me uneasy. But tonight, with the storm brewing and my nerves already frayed from a hellish day at work, it felt downright sinister. As I turned the corner, I saw them, a group of men huddled in the shadows, their low voices carrying an undercurrent of menace. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. And that decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. I'm not usually the type to take risks. My life is a carefully constructed routine of work, home, and the occasional night out with friends. But tonight, exhaustion clouded my judgment. I just wanted to get home, kick off these heels that were already giving me blisters, and forget about the mountain of paperwork waiting for me tomorrow. So I pressed on, keeping my head down and my pace brisk. The alley wasn't long, maybe 100 yards at most. I could make it through before they even noticed me. I was wrong. As I drew closer, the conversation died abruptly. I could feel their eyes on me, sizing me up. My heart began to race, blood pounding in my ears loud enough to drown out the distant rumble of thunder. Well, a gravelly voice called out. And what do we have here? I walked faster, my eyes fixed on the streetlight at the end of the alley, so close. Just a few more steps and I'd be back in the relative safety of the main road. A figure stepped into my path, blocking the way. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face half hidden by the shadow of a baseball cap. "Where you running off to, sweetheart?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. I stopped short, my mind racing. Should I turn and run? Try to push past him? My pepper spray was in my purse, but reaching for it now seemed impossible with my hands shaking so badly. "I'm just heading home," I managed to say, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. "Please, let me pass." A chorus of low chuckles erupted from the group. They were closing in now, forming a loose circle around me. I counted 5 of them, each more intimidating than the last. "Now why would we do that?" Another man spoke up. He was shorter than the first, but stocky, with arms corded with muscle. "We were just hoping for some company on this fine evening." My mouth went dry. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to me. I thought about screaming, but who would hear me over the storm? The street beyond the alley was deserted, most people having sought shelter from the impending downpour. "I have money," I said, fumbling with my purse. "Take it. Take everything. Just please, let me go." The first man, clearly the leader, stepped closer. I could smell cigarette smoke and something stronger on his breath. "Oh, we'll take that," he said softly. "But maybe we want a little more than just your cash." Panic surged through me like an electric current. In that moment, survival instinct overrode fear. I swung my purse with all my might, catching the leader off guard. It connected with the side of his head, sending him stumbling back. I ran. I didn't make it far. A hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with enough force to nearly dislocate my shoulder. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that was cut short as I was slammed against the brick wall of the alley. "You shouldn't have done that, bitch," the leader snarled, his face inches from mine. I could see his features clearly now, a scar running down one cheek, eyes cold and filled with rage. What happened next is a blur in my memory. I remember struggling, kicking, biting, anything to break free. I remember the taste of blood in my mouth, though I couldn't tell if it was mine or his. The other men were shouting, some egging him on, others sounding nervous. And then, cutting through it all, the sound of a police siren. The effect was instantaneous. The men scattered like roaches when the lights come on, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they had emerged. I slid down the wall, my legs no longer able to support me. 2 officers found me there, huddled on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. They were kind, wrapping me in a blanket and speaking in soft, reassuring tones as they called for backup and an ambulance. The next few hours passed in a haze of questions, medical examinations, and phone calls to my family. I gave my statement, described my attackers as best I could, but it all felt hollow. They were gone, vanished into the night, and the chances of them being caught seemed impossibly slim. It wasn't until much later, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by concerned friends and family, that the full weight of what had happened, and what could have happened, truly hit me. I broke down then, ugly, heaving sobs that felt like they were being torn from the very core of my being. The physical bruises faded within weeks. The emotional scars took much longer to heal. For months after the attack, I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. I couldn't walk down the street without constantly looking over my shoulder. The city I had once loved now felt like a minefield of potential threats. I started seeing a therapist, learning coping mechanisms and working through the trauma. Slowly, painfully, I began to reclaim my life. I took self-defense classes, not just for the physical skills, but for the confidence they instilled. I reconnected with friends I had pushed away in the aftermath of the attack, finding strength in their support and understanding. But still, the fear lingered. It was a constant companion, whispering warnings in my ear, making me second-guess every decision. It was nearly a year after the attack when I found myself facing another late night at the office. As I packed up my things, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. The thought of walking home, even along the well-lit main streets, filled me with dread. I stood at the office window, looking out at the city lights. In that moment, I realized I had a choice to make. I could let the fear win, let it dictate my life, and keep me trapped in this cycle of anxiety and avoidance. Or I could face it head-on. Taking a deep breath, I shouldered my bag and left the office. The night air was cool on my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to keep walking, my steps purposeful and steady. As I approached the entrance to Madsen Alley, I paused. The memories of that night came flooding back, threatening to overwhelm me. But this time, I didn't let them. I thought of how far I'd come, of the strength I'd discovered within myself, and I took a step forward. The alley was different now. The city had installed better lighting, and a security camera blinked at the entrance. But more than that, I was different. I wasn't the same scared woman who had been attacked here. I was a survivor, stronger and more resilient than I had ever thought possible. I walked through the alley with my head held high, pepper spray in hand, but not out of fear, out of preparedness. When I reached the other side, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had faced my demons and come out the other side. That night marked a turning point. It didn't erase what had happened, didn't magically cure all my anxieties, but it showed me that I was capable of overcoming them. I could reclaim my life, my city, my sense of safety. In the years that followed, I became an advocate for safer urban spaces and support for assault survivors. I shared my story, hoping it might help others find the strength to reclaim their own lives. And while I never forgot that night in the alley, it no longer defined me. As I stand here now, looking out over the city I once again call home, I'm reminded of a quote I once read. The bravest thing I ever did was continuing my life when I wanted to die. There were times in the aftermath of the attack when continuing seemed impossible, but I did. I survived. I thrived. And to anyone out there who's faced their own dark alley, who's struggling to find their way back to the light, I say this. You are stronger than you know. The path to healing isn't easy and it's rarely straight, but it's there. Keep walking. Keep fighting. Your story isn't over yet. The city lights flicker before me, no longer ominous but full of possibility. I take a deep breath of the night air and step forward, ready to face whatever comes next. Because now I know I can handle it. I'm not just a survivor, I'm alive. The bonfire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. Laughter and music filled the air as we celebrated the end of summer. It was perfect, the kind of night you wish could last forever. Then they arrived. At first, we thought they were just latecomers to the party. But as they drew closer, the laughter died, replaced by an uneasy silence. Their eyes gleamed with malice in the firelight, and I knew in that moment that our perfect night was about to become a nightmare. I'm not usually one for big gatherings, but when my best friend Jake insisted I come to his end-of-summer beach bash, I couldn't say no. Come on, Sarah, he'd pleaded. You've been cooped up all season working on your thesis. Live a little. So here I was, sand between my toes, a cold drink in my hand, surrounded by the warmth of friends and the rhythmic sound of waves lapping at the shore. The party was in full swing by sunset. Someone had brought a guitar, and an impromptu sing-along had broken out. I found myself relaxing, the stress of deadlines and academic pressure melting away in the glow of the bonfire and the company of friends. That's when I first noticed them. 6 figures approaching from down the beach, their silhouettes black against the fading light. Something about their gait, the purposeful way they moved, sent a chill down my spine despite the warmth of the evening. Jake noticed them too. He frowned, scanning the group around the fire. Hey, did anyone invite more people? A chorus of shaken heads and confused murmurs answered him. As the newcomers drew closer, the unease grew. They were all men, ranging in age from their 20s to maybe early 40s. Their clothes were dark, nondescript, but it was their expressions that truly unsettled me. Cold, calculating, predatory. The tallest of the group, a man with a shaved head and a scar running down one cheek, stepped forward. Nice little party you've got here, he said, his voice deceptively casual. Mind if we join? Before anyone could respond, they were among us. The music stopped abruptly as the guitarist clutched his instrument to his chest, eyeing the intruders warily. The comfortable atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a tension so thick you could almost taste it. Jake, ever the diplomat, tried to salvage the situation. Sure guys, grab a drink if you want. We were just... Shut up. Scarface cut him off, all pretense of friendliness gone. We're not here for your cheap beer or your shitty music. A girl named Lisa, Jake's girlfriend, stood up, anger overriding her fear. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to leave. Now. It happened so fast I almost missed it. Scarface's hand shot out, grabbing Lisa by the throat. She let out a choked gasp as he pulled her close, his face inches from hers. Sweetheart, he growled. You're in no position to be making demands. Chaos erupted. Jake lunged at Scarface, only to be intercepted by 2 of the other men. They drove him to the ground, fists flying. Around me, people were scrambling to their feet, some trying to run, others frozen in shock. I felt a hand wrap around my arm, yanking me backwards. I spun to face one of the intruders. a wiry man with tattooed knuckles and dead eyes. "Where do you think you're going, pretty?" he leered. Panic surged through me, clearing the fog of fear from my mind. Without thinking, I brought my knee up hard, catching him squarely between the legs. He doubled over with a wheeze, his grip loosening just enough for me to wrench free. I stumbled back, scanning the beach frantically. It was a nightmare scene illuminated by the still-burning bonfire. Jake was on the ground, blood streaming from his nose as he struggled against his attackers. Lisa was clawing at Scarface's hand, her face turning an alarming shade of red. Others were scattering in all directions, pursued by the remaining intruders. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and completely unprepared for this level of violence. We needed help, and fast. My eyes landed on Jake's backpack, discarded near the fire. His phone, if I could just reach it, call 911. I dove for the bag, my fingers closing around the zipper. A weight slammed into me from behind, driving me face first into the sand. I tasted blood as my lips split against my teeth. "Not so fast," a voice hissed in my ear. Rough hands flipped me over, and I found myself staring up at Tattoo Knuckles. The look in his eyes made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about robbery or some twisted power play. These men wanted to hurt us, to destroy us. A scream pierced the air. "Lisa." I turned my head to see Scarface dragging her towards the water, her heels leaving deep furrows in the sand as she fought against him. Something snapped inside me. The paralyzing fear gave way to a white-hot rage. This wasn't happening. I wouldn't let it happen. I brought my head up hard, smashing it into Tattoo Knuckles' face. Pain exploded through my skull, but the crunch of cartilage and his howl of agony told me I'd done some damage. His grip loosened, and I scrambled out from under him. My hand closed around something solid, a half-empty beer bottle someone had dropped in the chaos. I swung it with all my might, connecting with the side of Tattoo Knuckles' head as he lunged for me again. The bottle shattered, and he went down hard. I didn't wait to see if he'd get back up. I sprinted for the water towards Lisa's increasingly desperate cries. Scarface had her waist deep in the waves now, one hand still clamped around her throat as she thrashed against him. I hit the water at full speed, the cold shock of it barely registering through the adrenaline coursing through my veins. As I drew closer, I saw the glint of metal in Scarface's free hand, a knife. Time seemed to slow. I saw Lisa's eyes widen in terror as she saw the blade. I saw Scarface's arm begin to move, and I knew I had one chance to stop this. I dove, my body slamming into Scarface's midsection with every ounce of force I could muster. We went under in a tangle of limbs, the taste of salt water filling my mouth. I felt the knife nick my arm as we grappled, but the pain was distant, unimportant. We surfaced, gasping and spluttering. Lisa had broken free and was swimming for shore. Scarface roared in fury, bringing the knife down in a wild arc. I threw my arm up instinctively, crying out as the blade sliced deep into my forearm. But the pain brought clarity. I remembered the self-defense class I'd taken freshman year, the instructor's voice echoing in my head, "Use their strength against them." As Scarface wound up for another strike, I grabbed his wrist with both hands and pulled. Off balance and caught by surprise, he toppled forward. I ducked under his arm, twisting it behind his back as we'd practiced in class 100 times. The knife slipped from his grasp, disappearing beneath the waves. "You bitch," he snarled, thrashing against my hold. But I had leverage now, and desperation lent me strength I didn't know I possessed. I drove him face first into the water, holding him under for a long moment before letting him up to gasp for air. "Still want to play?" I hissed, tightening my grip on his twisted arm until he let out a grunt of pain. Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the night. Sirens. Red and blue lights appeared on the road above the beach, growing brighter by the second. "Looks like the party's over," I said, relief washing over me in a dizzying wave. The aftermath was a blur of police statements, paramedic attention, and tearful reunions. We learned later that one of the partygoers had managed to get to her car and drive for help. The police arrived just in time to catch most of the attackers as they tried to flee. As I sat on the back of an ambulance, wincing as a paramedic stitched up my arm, I watched the police lead Scarface and his crew away in handcuffs. Jake limped over, his face a mess of bruises but his eyes bright with a mix of concern and pride. "Sarah," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, You saved us. You were incredible." I managed a weak smile. Guess all those nights in the library paid off. Who knew research skills could translate to fighting off psychos? He laughed, then winced, holding his ribs. "Seriously, though, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if..." I reached out with my good arm and squeezed his hand. "Hey, what are friends for?" As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what we'd just been through began to sink in. The fear, the violence, the knowledge of how close we'd come to real tragedy. It was overwhelming. But looking around at my friends, battered but alive, I felt something else too. A fierce pride, a sense of strength I'd never known I had. The night that was supposed to mark the end of summer had become something else entirely. An ending, yes, of innocence, of the illusion of safety, but also a beginning. We had faced true darkness and come out the other side. We were survivors. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, I stood at the water's edge, letting the gentle waves wash over my feet. The beach was empty now, save for a few lingering police officers, but I could still feel the echoes of the night's events, the terror, the fury, the triumph. I took a deep breath, tasting salt and smoke on the air. Whatever came next, whatever challenges life threw at us, I knew we could face them. We were stronger than we'd ever imagined, and we were not afraid. The old house creaked and groaned like a living thing, settling into the quiet of the night. I'd been house-sitting for my aunt for 3 days, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was silly, of course, just my imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. But as I stood at the top of the basement stairs, my hand hovering over the light switch, a chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just a quick check to make sure the old furnace was still running. I flicked on the light and took my first step down. That's when I heard it, a soft shuffle, like something dragging across the concrete floor. And in that moment, I realized my fears weren't so silly after all. I'm not usually the jumpy type. At 17, I pride myself on being level-headed and rational. When Aunt Carol asked if I'd watch her house while she was on vacation, I jumped at the chance. A whole week of freedom, away from my parents, watchful eyes. It sounded like paradise. The first couple of days were great. I invited a few friends over, stayed up late watching movies, and enjoyed the novelty of having a big house all to myself. But as the week wore on, a strange uneasiness began to settle over me. It started with little things, objects that weren't quite where I'd left them, the faint sound of footsteps when I knew I was alone. Once, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move at the end of the hallway, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. I tried to rationalize it all away. Old houses make noise. My memory was playing tricks on me. I was just letting the unfamiliarity of the place get to me. But standing there on those basement stairs, hearing that unmistakable sound of movement below, all my rationalizations crumbled away. My heart pounded in my chest as I took another step down, then another. The bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs cast harsh shadows across the cluttered space. Boxes and old furniture created a maze of potential hiding spots. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice quavered. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me, but it felt charged, expectant, like the whole house was holding its breath. I reached the bottom of the stairs, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of wrongness intensified with every passing second. That's when I saw it. A door, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. A door I was certain hadn't been there when I'd come down to check the furnace yesterday. My hands shook as I approached. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to get out of the house and call the police. But curiosity, that dangerous impulse that so often overrides common sense, propelled me forward. I pushed aside the boxes, revealing a door that looked much older than the rest of the house. Its wood was dark with age, the iron handle pitted and worn. There was no keyhole, no visible way to lock it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grasped the handle and pulled. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. Beyond lay darkness so complete it seemed almost solid. The weak light from the basement barely penetrated a foot past the threshold. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes. Shelves lined the walls, laden with objects I couldn't quite make out. In the center of the room stood a table, something dark and bulky atop it. I fumbled for my phone, switching on its flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene that made my blood run cold. The shelves were filled with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and every single one showed people who seemed unaware they were being photographed. People on the street, in their homes, going about their daily lives. Some of the photos were clearly old, faded and yellowing. Others looked like they could have been taken yesterday. But it was what lay on the table that truly horrified me. Stacks of papers, covered in cramped handwriting. As I drew closer, I could make out names, addresses, detailed descriptions of daily routines. And beside the papers, a collection of objects that made no sense together. A child's hair ribbon, a man's wedding ring, a worn leather wallet. This wasn't just a hidden room, it was a shrine to obsession, a meticulously cataloged record of lives observed without permission. I backed away, my mind reeling. Who could have done this? How long had this room been here, hidden away in my aunt's basement? In my shock, I nearly missed the most terrifying detail of all. There, in a frame on the nearest shelf, was a photo of me. It had been taken just days ago, showing me walking up to my aunt's house with my suitcase in hand. My arrival to house sit captured by someone who should not have been there. Panic seized me. I turned to flee only to find my path blocked. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the basement light. Tall, unnaturally thin, with hands that seemed too long for its arms. "You weren't supposed to find this place," Orin said, its voice a dry whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "But now that you have, I'm afraid you'll have to stay." I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that tore from my throat. I lunged forward, hoping to slip past the figure, to reach the stairs and the safety of the world above. But it was faster than I expected. Long fingers wrapped around my arm, yanking me back with inhuman strength. I felt myself being pulled into the darkness of the hidden room, the door beginning to swing shut behind us. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I twisted in its grip, bringing my knee up hard. It connected with something solid, and I heard a grunt of pain. The fingers loosened just enough for me to wrench free. I didn't look back, didn't try to see what manner of creature had grabbed me. I ran, taking the basement stairs two at a time, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I burst out of the house into the cool night air, not stopping until I reached the street. Only then did I dare to look back. The house stood silent and dark, no sign of movement at any of the windows. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that something was watching me from behind those darkened panes. I ran to the neighbors, pounding on their door until they answered. Through tears and gasping breaths, I tried to explain what had happened. They must have thought I was crazy, this teenage girl babbling about hidden rooms and mysterious figures. But they saw my genuine terror, and they called the police. The next few hours were a blur of questions and disbelief. The police searched the house but found nothing out of the ordinary. No hidden door in the basement, no room full of photographs. They were kind but dismissive, chalking it up to an overactive imagination and too many late-night horror movies. When my aunt returned from her vacation, she was sympathetic but equally skeptical. She'd lived in that house for 20 years, she said. If there was a secret room, she would know about it. In the end, I was left with nothing but my own certainty about what I'd seen. For weeks afterward, I jumped at every shadow, checked every closet before I went to bed. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the safety of my own home. It wasn't until months later that I found the courage to look closely at the photos from my time house sitting. In one a selfie I'd taken in my aunt's living room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There in the background, barely visible in the reflection of a mirror, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, with hands that seemed too long for its arms. I never house sit anymore. I avoid old houses and basements, and I always check the backgrounds of my photos, because I know now that sometimes the monsters we fear are real, and they're watching, always watching from places we'd never think to look to. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential rain as I squinted into the darkness, searching for any sign of civilization. My phone had died hours ago, leaving me without GPS or any way to call for help. That's when I saw him, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb outstretched. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. Little did I know, this simple act of kindness would turn into a nightmarish game of cat and mouse, where the stakes were life and death. I've always prided myself on being a good judge of character. It's a skill that served me well in my job as a social worker. But as I pulled over to the side of the road that night, I realized how easily that confidence could become a fatal flaw. The man hurried to my passenger side door, hunched against the relentless downpour. I leaned over to unlock it, catching a glimpse of a gaunt face and desperate eyes before he clambered inside. "Thank you," he gasped, water streaming from his sodden clothes onto my car's upholstery. I thought I was going to be stuck out there all night. "No problem," I replied, trying to mask my unease with a friendly smile. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road a ways," he said vaguely, gesturing ahead. "There's a town about 20 miles from here. I can direct you." I nodded, pulling back onto the empty highway. The rhythmic swish of the wipers and the drumming of rain on the roof filled the silence between us. "I'm Sarah, by the way," I offered, hoping some conversation might ease the tension I felt building in my chest. "Tom," he replied after a beat too long. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." As we drove, I snuck glances at my passenger. He was older than I'd initially thought, probably in his late 40s, with deep-set eyes and a day's worth of stubble on his chin. His clothes were worn but not filthy, and he didn't have the desperate look of a homeless person. Still, something about him set me on edge. "So, what brings you out on a night like this, Tom?" I asked, keeping my tone light. He shifted in his seat. "Car broke down a few miles back. No cell service out here to call for help." I nodded sympathetically, though a part of me wondered why he hadn't mentioned this when he first got in the car. Wouldn't that have been the first thing he said? The minutes ticked by, and the unease in my stomach grew. Tom's directions became increasingly convoluted, taking us off the main highway onto smaller, darker roads. The rain, if anything, intensified, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of the car. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, unable to keep the worry from my voice. Tom's head snapped towards me, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the dashboard. "You calling me a liar?" The sudden hostility in his tone made me flinch. "No, I don't recognize any of this. Maybe we should turn back to the highway." His hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Keep driving." Fear flooded through me, sharp and cold. This was bad. This was very, very bad. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Tom, you're hurting me. Please let go." Instead, his grip tightened. I said, "Keep driving." My mind raced. I was alone on a dark road in the middle of nowhere with a man who clearly meant me harm. I had no phone, no way to call for help. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced it down. I needed to think. That's when I saw it. A glint of metal in Tom's free hand. A knife. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "You're going to keep driving where I tell you. When we get where we're going, you're going to give me your wallet, your jewelry, and your car keys. Then, if you're lucky, I'll let you walk away." I nodded, not trusting my voice. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I followed his directions, taking us deeper into the wilderness. I knew I couldn't let him get me to wherever he was planning. I had to do something, and fast. An idea formed. Desperate. Dangerous. But possibly my only chance. I remembered a sharp curve in the road we'd passed earlier, with a steep embankment on one side. If I could make it back there, I began to talk, rambling about anything that came to mind. My job, my family, the weather, anything to distract Tom and make him think I was complying. All the while, I was watching the road, looking for landmarks I recognized. There, a gnarled old tree I'd noticed earlier. We were getting close. "You know," I said, forcing a laugh. "It's funny. I've driven this road 100 times and never picked up a hitchhiker before. Guess there's a first time for everything, right?" Tom grunted, his attention divided between watching me and peering out at the rain-soaked night. I saw the curve approaching and knew it was now or never. Taking a deep breath, I stomped on the accelerator. The car leapt forward, engine roaring. Tom shouted in surprise, the knife wavering in his grip. We hit the curve at breakneck speed, tires squealing on the wet asphalt. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending us spinning towards the embankment. Tom's knife clattered to the floor as he was thrown against the passenger door. The world outside became a dizzying blur of darkness and rain. Then we were airborne. The car left the road, plunging down the steep slope. I had just enough time to brace myself before we hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact. The airbag exploded in my face, dazing me. For a moment, all I could hear was the hiss of the deflating bag and the tick-tick-tick of the ruined engine. Then, slowly, other sounds filtered in. The patter of rain, a groan from beside me. Tom. He was still alive, ignoring the pain that radiated through my body. I fumbled with my seatbelt. I had to get out, had to get away before he recovered. The belt finally came free and I all but fell out of the car, my legs wobbly beneath me. The rain was still coming down in sheets, quickly soaking through my clothes. I looked around wildly, trying to orient myself. The car had come to rest at the bottom of the embankment, its headlights casting weak beams into the surrounding forest. A sound from inside the car spurred me into action. I took off running, branches whipping at my face as I plunged into the woods. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to put as much distance between myself and Tom as possible. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Only then did I allow myself to stop, collapsing against a tree trunk. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. Nothing but the steady drum of rain on leaves. As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of my situation sank in. I was lost in the woods, in the middle of the night, in a rainstorm. I had no phone, no idea which direction would lead me to safety, and somewhere out there, a dangerous man might be looking for me. I allowed myself a moment of despair, hot tears mingling with the cold rain on my face. Then I took a deep breath and forced myself to think. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving, had to find help. I picked a direction and started walking, using the edge of my hand to shield my eyes from the rain. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. Was it Tom? Had he found me? I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the dark, wet forest. But eventually, miraculously, I saw a light in the distance. As I drew closer, I realized it was a house, a small cabin set back from a dirt road. Hope surged through me. I stumbled towards it, my exhausted legs finding new strength. As I neared the porch, a motion-activated light flickered on, momentarily blinding me. I pounded on the door, praying someone was home. "Help!" I croaked, my voice hoarse from fear and exertion. "Please, I need help." Long seconds ticked by. Then I heard movement inside, and the door creaked open. An elderly man peered out at me, confusion and concern etched on his weathered face. "Good Lord, child," he said, taking in my bedraggled appearance. The soft ding of the elevator arriving at the parking garage level echoed in the empty corridor. As the doors slid open, the flickering fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow on the concrete walls. I stepped out, my heels clicking on the hard floor, the sound amplified in the oppressive silence. That's when I heard it. Muffled voices, angry and urgent, coming from behind a nearby pillar. I froze, my hand instinctively tightening on my purse strap. In that moment, I had to make a choice. Turn back and pretend I hadn't heard anything, or investigate and potentially walk into danger. Little did I know, the decision I made in those few seconds would change my life forever. I've always been the type to mind my own business. As a junior executive at a cutthroat finance firm, I learned early on that keeping your head down and your ears closed was often the safest path to success. But something about those voices, the desperation and fear lacing their tones, made me hesitate. I inched closer to the pillar, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. As I peered around the corner, the scene that unfolded before me made my blood run cold. 3 men stood in a tight circle, their backs to me. In the center, on his knees, was a 4th man. Even from behind, I could see he was trembling, his hands raised in a pleading gesture. "Please," I heard him whimper, "I'll get you the money. I just need more time." One of the standing men, tall and broad-shouldered with a shaved head, leaned down. The overhead light glinted off something in his hand, a gun. "Time's up, Johnny," he growled. "The boss doesn't like waiting. You know how this ends." I should have run, should have turned around, gotten back in that elevator, and pretended I'd never seen any of this. But my body seemed frozen in place, my mind racing with the realization that I was witnessing what might very well be a man's last moments alive. Without thinking, I fumbled for my phone. If I could just call the police. Maybe. The phone slipped from my sweaty fingers, clattering to the ground with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire garage. 4 heads snapped in my direction. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. I stared at them. They stared at me. All of us caught in a tableau of shock and dawning horror. Then everything happened at once. "Grab her!" the man with the gun shouted. I turned to run, but my heels betrayed me. I stumbled, my ankle twisting painfully as I fell to the hard concrete. Before I could get up, rough hands seized my arms, dragging me toward the group. "No, please!" I cried out, struggling against their grip. "I didn't see anything, I swear." The man with the gun approached, his face a mask of cold fury. "It looks like we've got ourselves a little spy, boys," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "What should we do with her?" One of the others, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, spoke up. "We can't let her go, boss. She'll talk." The gunman nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "You're right. Can't have any loose ends." Terror unlike anything I'd ever known coursed through me. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not here, in the familiar parking garage of the building where I'd worked for the past 3 years. "Please," I begged, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have money. I can pay you. Just let me go. I won't say a word. I promise." The gunman laughed, a harsh sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh, sweetheart, you don't have nearly enough money to buy your way out of this." He raised the gun, pointing it directly at my forehead. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but the shot never came. Instead, a new voice cut through the tension. "Wait!" It was the man on his knees, Johnny. He struggled to his feet, his eyes darting between me and the gunman. "I know her," he said. "She works upstairs. In finance." The gunman lowered his weapon slightly, a look of interest crossing his face. "Is that right? Well, maybe we can work something out after all." He turned back to me, a predatory smile spreading across his features. "Here's the deal, sweetheart. Your friend Johnny here owes us a lot of money. Money he doesn't have, but maybe you do. Or at least, you have access to it." My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. I don't understand. "What do you want from me?" "It's simple," he replied. "You're going to help us get into the building's financial systems. You're going to transfer the money Johnny owes us, plus a little extra for our trouble. Do that, and maybe, just maybe, we let you both walk out of here alive." I shook my head, panic rising in my throat. "I can't. I don't have that kind of access. And even if I did, the systems are locked down after hours. There's no way." The gun was back in my face before I could finish. "Find a way," he snarled, "or I start putting bullets in your friend here until you change your mind." To emphasize his point, he swung the gun toward Johnny, who flinched and raised his hands again. "Okay," I cried out. "Okay, I'll try. Just please, don't hurt anyone." The gunman nodded to his companions, who hauled me to my feet. We made our way to the elevator, a grotesque parody of a group of co-workers heading up to the office for a late night. As we rode up, my mind raced. I knew I couldn't actually access the kind of money these men wanted. Even if I could, transferring it would set off all kinds of alarms. But maybe, if I could just buy some time, find a way to alert security. The elevator doors opened onto our floor. It was dark and quiet, most of the staff having gone home hours ago. They marched me to my desk, shoving me down into my chair. "Get to work," the gunman ordered. With shaking hands, I logged into my computer. I pulled up various financial systems, making a show of typing and clicking while my mind scrambled for a plan. "This is taking too long," the man with the scar growled after a few minutes. "I'm trying," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The system is complicated. One wrong move and it'll lock me out entirely." The gunman leaned in close, his breath hot on my ear. "You've got 5 minutes. After that, we start shooting. Got it?" I nodded, swallowing hard. 5 minutes. What could I do in 5 minutes that would save us? That's when I remembered the silent alarm. Hidden under every desk was a small button, designed to alert security in case of an emergency. If I could just reach it without them noticing. I shifted in my chair, trying to make the movement look natural. My hand inched toward the underside of the desk. "What are you doing?" The scarred man snapped. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Just stretching. It helps me think." He grunted, unconvinced, but didn't stop me. My fingers found the button. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what might happen next, and pressed it. For a moment, nothing changed. The men continued to loom over me, growing increasingly impatient. But then, so faintly I thought I might be imagining it, I heard the distant sound of an elevator arriving. The gunman heard it too. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. What was that? Before I could answer, the lights in the office suddenly blazed to life. A voice boomed over the intercom system. "This is security. We've detected an unauthorized entry. The police have been notified and are on their way. Remain where you are." Chaos erupted. The men started shouting, panic replacing their earlier bravado. The gunman grabbed my arm, yanking me out of the chair. "You little bitch," he hissed. "You're coming with us. You try anything, and I'll put a bullet in your head before the cops ever get here. Understand?" I nodded, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. He dragged me toward the stairwell, the others following close behind. We had just reached the door when it burst open. Two security guards rushed in, their own weapons drawn. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. "Drop your weapons." What happened next was a blur of motion and noise. The gunman shoved me hard, sending me sprawling to the floor. Shots rang out, deafeningly loud in the confined space. I covered my head with my arms, praying I wouldn't feel the bite of a bullet. When the shooting stopped, I slowly looked up. The gunman and one of his companions were on the ground, moaning in pain. The other two had their hands up, weapons discarded. The security guards were calling for backup, their voices seeming to come from very far away. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I started to shake uncontrollably, tears streaming down my face. One of the security guards knelt beside me, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right, miss? Are you hurt?" I shook my head, unable to form words. He helped me to my feet just as the elevator dinged again, disgorging a swarm of police officers. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions and statements. I told my story over and over, to police, to my boss, to a kind-faced victim advocate who appeared at some point. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I stood at the window of the conference room where I'd been sequestered. The city was waking up, people going about their morning routines, blissfully unaware of the drama that had unfolded in this building overnight. I thought about how close I'd come to death, how a simple decision to work late could have been my last, but I also thought about the courage I'd found within myself, the quick thinking that had saved not just my life, but Johnny's as well. As I watched the sun rise over the skyline, I made a promise to myself. I would never again be a passive observer in my own life. I would speak up, take action, make a difference. Because sometimes, the most important choice you make is the choice to get involved. The world outside looked different now, full of both danger and possibility. But I was different too. Stronger, braver, ready to face whatever came next. The first text arrived at 3:17 a.m. The soft buzz of my phone on the nightstand jolted me awake, my heart racing as I fumbled for the device. Who could be messaging me at this hour? As my eyes adjusted to the harsh glow of the screen, I felt a chill run down my spine. The message, from an unknown number, read, "Nice pajamas. Blue really suits you." I sat bolt upright, suddenly wide awake. How could anyone know what I was wearing? I was alone in my locked apartment, curtains drawn tight against the night. Or at least, I thought I was alone. That text was just the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the brink of sanity and make me question everything I thought I knew about privacy and safety in the modern world. I've always been a bit of a loner. At 28, I work from home as a graphic designer, my days spent in comfortable solitude, communicating with clients via email and video calls. My apartment is my sanctuary, a place where I can be completely myself without fear of judgment or intrusion, or so I believed. After that first text, I spent the rest of the night wide awake, checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows. I even did a thorough sweep of my apartment, looking for hidden cameras or any sign that someone had been inside. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of violation lingered like a bad taste in my mouth. When morning came, I tried to convince myself it was just a prank. Maybe a friend had seen me through the window earlier and was messing with me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. None of my friends would do something so creepy, and my apartment is on the 5th floor. Not exactly easy to peek into. I went about my day as normally as I could, trying to focus on work and push the unsettling message out of my mind. But at 1:42 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. "The Chinese takeout smells good. Enjoy your lunch." My blood ran cold. I had indeed just sat down with a container of lo mein, the aroma of soy sauce and vegetables filling my small kitchen. How could they possibly know? I abandoned my lunch, suddenly nauseous. This wasn't a prank or a coincidence. Someone was watching me. somehow seeing into the most private moments of my life. But how? The texts kept coming throughout the day, each one more specific and unnerving than the last. You should really water that plant by the window. It's looking a bit droopy. That client's logo design is coming along nicely. The red is a bold choice. You might want to pick up your dry cleaning tomorrow. That interview outfit needs to look sharp. With each message, my panic grew. I felt like a rat in a maze. Every move scrutinized by some unseen observer. I searched my apartment again, this time more thoroughly. I checked every nook and cranny, looking for tiny cameras or listening devices. I even called a professional sweep service, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. The lack of evidence only made things worse. If there were no devices in my apartment, how were they doing this? Was I losing my mind? I stopped leaving my apartment altogether, having groceries and essentials delivered. I covered all my windows with thick blackout curtains and put tape over the cameras on my laptop and phone. But still, the texts came. The new curtains are a bit much, don't you think? I preferred the view before. Hiding under the blankets won't make me go away, you know. I was a prisoner in my own home, and my jailer was a faceless entity that seemed to know my every move. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, jolting awake at every small sound, convinced that my tormentor was finally making their physical presence known. After a week of this psychological torture, I finally broke down and called the police. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic but skeptical. Without any physical evidence of a break-in or tangible threats, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I change my phone number and advised me to seek help if I was experiencing paranoid thoughts. Frustrated and feeling utterly alone, I turned to the internet. Surely someone out there must have experienced something similar. I spent hours scouring forums and chat rooms, looking for any information that might help me understand what was happening. That's when I stumbled upon a thread that made my blood run cold. Other people were describing similar experiences, mysterious texts detailing their private moments, an unseen presence seemingly able to watch their every move. Many of the stories ended with the victims fleeing their homes, starting new lives in an attempt to escape their unseen stalkers. But one comment caught my eye. A user claiming to be an ex-government cybersecurity expert suggested that these incidents might be related to a new type of malware, one capable of hijacking smart devices and turning them into surveillance tools. The idea was terrifying, but also somehow comforting. If this was a tech issue, maybe it could be solved with tech. Armed with this new information, I reached out to an old college friend who now worked in IT security. After swearing him to secrecy, I explained my situation. He was skeptical at first, but as I showed him the long string of eerily accurate texts, I saw the color drain from his face. This is not good," he muttered, scrolling through the messages. "I've heard rumors about this kind of thing, but I've never seen it in action before." Over the next few days, my friend worked tirelessly to uncover the source of the invasion. He ran diagnostics on all my devices, checked my network for vulnerabilities, and even set up monitoring tools to track any unusual data transfers. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found something. "It's your smart home system," he said, his voice a mix of awe and horror. "Someone's managed to hack into it and gain control of, well, everything. Your security cameras, your thermostat, even your smart fridge. They've essentially turned your entire apartment into a giant surveillance device." The revelation was like a punch to the gut. I had invested in a top-of-the-line smart home system just a few months ago, thinking it would make my life easier and more secure. Instead, it had become the very tool used to torment me. With my friend's help, we began the process of purging my apartment of every smart device. It was like stepping back in time, replacing my smart TV with an old-fashioned model, swapping out light bulbs, even going back to a simple flip phone. Each change felt like shedding a layer of vulnerability, slowly reclaiming my privacy. The text stopped abruptly after we removed the last smart device. The silence was almost as unnerving as the constant messages had been. I found myself jumping at small noises, half expecting to hear the buzz of an incoming text. But as days passed without incident, I slowly began to relax. I started sleeping through the night again, no longer jolting awake at every creak of the building. I even ventured outside, rediscovering the simple pleasure of a walk in the park without fear of being watched. It was during one of these walks, about 2 weeks after the last text, that I saw him, a man sitting on a park bench, intensely focused on his phone. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, but something in the way he held himself made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. As I approached, he looked up. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew this was the one who had been watching me, tormenting me for weeks. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he stood up and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before I could react. I stood there, frozen, as people streamed around me. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to confront him and demand answers, but a larger part was simply relieved that it was over, that I could finally put this nightmare behind me. In the months that followed, I slowly rebuilt my life. I moved to a new apartment, one without any smart features. I changed my name, my job, even my appearance. Paranoia, perhaps, but after what I'd been through, it felt like a small price to pay for peace of mind. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself checking for hidden cameras or listening for the buzz of an incoming text. The experience left scars that may never fully heal, but it also taught me valuable lessons about the price of convenience and the importance of guarding our privacy in an increasingly connected world. As I sit here now, writing this story on an old-fashioned typewriter, no internet connection, thank you very much, I can't help but wonder about all the people out there who might be unknowingly living in glass houses, their every move observed by unseen eyes. If my experience serves as a warning to even one person, then perhaps some good can come from those terrifying weeks. To anyone reading this, look around you. How many devices in your home are watching, listening, collecting data, and, more importantly, who might be on the other end, piecing together the intimate details of your life? In this brave new world of smart homes and interconnected devices, sometimes the wisest choice is to simply unplug. The knock on my hotel room door came at precisely 11:23 p.m. I remember checking the clock, irritated at the late disturbance. When I opened the door, 2 men in crisp suits stood before me, badges glinting under the hallway lights. "We're with hotel security," the taller one said, his voice low and urgent. "There's been an incident, and we need to ask you a few questions." I hesitated, sleep-addled and confused, but stepped aside to let them in. It wasn't until the door clicked shut behind them that I realized my mistake. These weren't hotel security at all, and I had just invited danger into my room with open arms. I'd arrived in Miami earlier that day, a much-needed vacation after months of grueling work at the law firm. The hotel was a splurge, one of those gleaming high-rises that dotted the coastline, promising luxury and escape. I'd spent the evening at the rooftop bar, watching the sun set over the ocean and feeling the tension of the past year slowly uncoil from my shoulders. Now, as I faced these 2 strangers in my room, that peaceful feeling evaporated like mist in the morning sun. "What's this about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What kind of incident?" The shorter man, stocky with a close-cropped beard, spoke up. "We'll ask the questions, if you don't mind. Where were you between 8 and 10 p.m. this evening?" I frowned, my legal training kicking in despite my growing unease. "I was at the rooftop bar. You can check with the staff there. Now, I'd like to see some identification, please." The 2 men exchanged glances. Then, moving with a speed that took me by surprise, the taller one grabbed my arm while the other produced a gun from inside his jacket. "Sit down and shut up," the armed man growled. "This doesn't have to get messy." Heart pounding, I sank onto the edge of the bed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who were these men? What did they want? "Look," I said, holding up my hands in what I hoped was a calming gesture. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. I'm just here on vacation. I don't know anything about any incident." The taller man, still gripping my arm, leaned in close. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, Ms. Carter, or should I say Agent Carter?" I blinked, genuinely confused now. "Agent, I'm not. I'm a lawyer, corporate law. There must be some mistake." The man with the gun snorted. "Drop the act. We know you're CIA. We know you're here about the microchip. So why don't you make this easy on yourself and tell us where it is?" My mind whirled. CIA, microchip. This had to be some kind of bizarre dream. But the bruising grip on my arm and the very real gun pointed at my chest told me otherwise. "I swear to you, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. "My name is Sarah Carter. I'm a lawyer with Bradshaw and Associates in Chicago. You can call them, they'll verify." The slap came out of nowhere, snapping my head to the side and bringing tears to my eyes. "Enough lies," the shorter man snarled. "We don't have time for this. Tell us where the chip is, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you." As I gingerly touched my stinging cheek, a thought occurred to me. These men, whoever they were, had made a mistake. They thought I was someone else, someone involved in something far more dangerous than corporate mergers and acquisitions. If I could just convince them of the truth. "Please," I said, forcing myself to meet their eyes. "I know you think I'm this agent, but I'm not. There's been a mix-up. Look in my purse. My work ID is in there. My passport. They'll prove I'm telling the truth." The taller man nodded to his partner, who kept the gun trained on me while the other rifled through my belongings. I held my breath, praying they'd see reason. After what felt like an eternity, the man straightened up, holding my passport and work ID. He studied them for a long moment, his brow furrowed. "Oh, these look real," he muttered. "Because they are real," I insisted. "I'm not who you think I am. Please, just let me go. I won't say anything about this, I swear." The two men stepped away, conferring in low voices. I strained to hear what they were saying, catching snatches of their conversation. Could be a deep cover. But the intel said, "Need to be sure." Finally, they turned back to me. The shorter man, still holding the gun, spoke. "All right, Miss Carter, if that is your real name, we're going to make a call to verify your story. If you're telling the truth, you'll be free to go. If not..." He left the threat hanging in the air. As the taller man stepped into the bathroom to make the call, I allowed myself a small flicker of hope. Surely once they confirmed my identity, this nightmare would be over. But that hope was short-lived. The man emerged from the bathroom, his face grim. "The number for Bradshaw and Associates is disconnected, and there's no record of a Sarah Carter working there in any of the legal databases." My stomach dropped. How was that possible? I'd worked at Bradshaw for 5 years. There had to be some mistake. That's impossible," I stammered. "Try again, please. There must be some kind of error." The shorter man shook his head, raising the gun once more. "No more games. You've got one last chance. Where is the chip?" Panic clawed at my throat. This couldn't be happening. Any moment now, I'd wake up in my bed. This whole ordeal nothing more than a vivid nightmare. But I didn't wake up. Instead, I watched in horror as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I lunged to the side, grabbing the heavy lamp from the bedside table and swinging it with all my might. It connected with the gunman's hand just as the weapon discharged, the bullet burying itself in the wall inches from my head. The room erupted into chaos. I swung the lamp again, catching the taller man in the stomach as he tried to grab me. He doubled over, gasping for air. I didn't wait to see if they'd recover. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway in my pajamas and bare feet. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the pounding of footsteps. I hit the stairwell running, taking the steps 2 at a time. My lungs burned and my feet ached from slapping against the concrete, but fear drove me onward. I had no plan beyond get away, no idea where I was going or what I'd do when I got there. I burst out of the stairwell into the lobby, startling a group of late-night revelers. Without stopping, I dashed past the bewildered desk clerk and out into the warm Miami night. The street was busy, and even at this late hour, I melted into the crowd, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone around me must hear it. I glanced back, seeing my pursuers emerge from the hotel, their heads swiveling as they searched for me. I ducked into a nearby alley, pressing myself against the cool brick wall and trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why didn't my work check out? Who were those men? And who did they think I was? As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone in a strange city, with no money, no ID, and no idea who to trust. Whoever those men were, they had resources. They'd be looking for me, and I had no way to prove I was who I said I was. I slid down the wall, hugging my knees to my chest. Tears of fear and frustration welled up in my eyes. How had a simple vacation turned into this nightmare? But I couldn't stay here. I had to move, had to figure out what was going on and how to clear my name. With a deep breath, I pushed myself to my feet. First things first, I needed clothes, money, and a safe place to think. As I stepped out of the alley, a plan began to form. I'd find an internet cafe, try to contact someone from home who could vouch for me. Maybe there was a simple explanation for the mix-up with my work. And if not, well, I'd cross that bridge when I came to it. For now, I had to focus on survival. One step at a time. I squared my shoulders and set off down the street, just another face in the crowd. But with every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that danger lurked around every corner. My relaxing vacation had turned into a fight for my life, my identity, and my freedom. And I had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The old cash register clattered shut with a familiar ring, echoing through the empty convenience store. I glanced at the clock, 11:58 p.m. Just 2 more minutes and my shift would be over. As I started to tidy up, the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, forcing a tired smile, ready to deal with one last customer before I could finally head home. But the man who walked in wasn't here to buy anything. His face was hidden beneath a dark hoodie, and in his trembling hand, he held a gun pointed straight at me. In that moment, I realized my night was far from over. It was about to become the longest and most terrifying of my life. I've worked the night shift at Jerry's Gas & Go for about 6 months now. It's not glamorous work, but it helps pay for college, and the quiet hours give me time to study. Most nights are uneventful, the occasional drunk looking for more booze, truckers fueling up on coffee and snacks, and the regular parade of insomniacs and night owls. Tonight had been particularly slow. I'd spent most of my shift reading my biology textbook, looking forward to crawling into bed and catching a few hours of sleep before my 8 a.m. class. But as I stared down the barrel of that gun, all thoughts of sleep and school evaporated. "Empty the register," the man growled, his voice muffled by a bandana pulled up over his mouth and nose. "Now!" My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, trying to open the cash drawer. Okay, I stammered. Just don't hurt me, please." As I started pulling out bills, I tried to get a better look at the robber. He was tall and thin, with bloodshot eyes darting nervously around the store. His hand holding the gun trembled slightly, and I could see beads of sweat on his forehead. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was a desperate man doing something stupid. I held out the handful of cash. "Here," I said. trying to keep my voice steady. "It's all yours. Just take it and go." He snatched the money with his free hand, stuffing it into his pocket. But he didn't leave. Instead, he gestured with the gun towards the back of the store. "Safe," he barked. "Open it." My stomach dropped. I can't," I said. "I don't have the combination. Only the manager can open it." The man's eyes narrowed. "You're lying," he hissed, taking a step closer. "Open it, or I swear to God, I'll shoot." I raised my hands, feeling panic start to set in. "I swear, I'm telling the truth. I'm just a part-time clerk. They don't give us the safe combination." For a long moment, he just stared at me, his finger twitching on the trigger. I held my breath, certain that at any second, I was going to hear the deafening crack of a gunshot. But then, unexpectedly, his shoulders sagged. The hand holding the gun lowered slightly. "Shit," he muttered. "Shit, shit, shit." In that moment of hesitation, I saw my chance. I lunged for the panic button hidden under the counter, my fingers just brushing against it before a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "What did you do?" the robber screamed, his earlier nervousness replaced by fury. "What the fuck did you do?" "Nothing," I lied, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "I swear, I didn't do anything." But the faint sound of sirens in the distance gave me away. The robber's eyes widened with fear and rage. "You stupid bitch," he snarled. "You've ruined everything." Before I could react, he vaulted over the counter, grabbing me roughly by the arm. "You're coming with me," he said, dragging me towards the back of the store. "You're my ticket out of here." I struggled against his grip, but fear had given him strength. He pulled me through the stockroom and out the back door, the cool night air hitting my face as we emerged into the alley behind the store. The sirens were getting louder now. The robber looked around frantically, clearly not having planned for this scenario. That's when he spotted my beat-up old Honda parked near the dumpster. "Keys," he demanded, shoving the gun into my ribs. "Now." With shaking hands, I fished my keys out of my pocket and handed them over. He pushed me roughly into the passenger seat before sliding behind the wheel. The engine sputtered to life, and we peeled out of the alley just as the first police car rounded the corner. As we sped through the empty streets, my mind raced. What was going to happen to me? Would he kill me once I was no longer useful? I thought about my mom, probably asleep at home, unaware that her only child had just been kidnapped. Would I ever see her again? The robber drove erratically, constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. His earlier bravado had faded, replaced by a palpable sense of panic. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You don't have to do this. Just let me out, and I won't tell them which way you went. You can still get away." He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Right. And I'm sure you won't immediately call the cops and tell them exactly what I look like and what car I'm driving. No, you're staying with me until I figure this out." We drove for what felt like hours, eventually leaving the city behind and entering the sprawling suburbs. The robber seemed to be driving aimlessly, with no clear destination in mind. Finally, he pulled into the parking lot of an abandoned strip mall. The faded signs of long-closed businesses loomed over us as he cut the engine. Okay," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, think. What now?" I stayed silent, afraid that anything I said might set him off, but as I watched him mutter to himself, an idea began to form. Maybe I could reason with him, appeal to whatever shred of humanity was left. "What's your name?" I asked softly. He glared at me suspiciously. "What does it matter?" I'd like to know who I'm talking to. I'm Amy." He was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "Mike. My name's Mike." "Okay, Mike. Can I ask, why are you doing this? You don't seem like someone who usually robs stores at gunpoint." Mike's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "You don't know anything about me." You're right. I don't, I said. But I'd like to understand. Maybe I can help. He snorted. Help? How could you possibly help? I shrugged. I don't know, but I'm a good listener. And right now, it seems like you could use someone to talk to. For a moment, I thought he might lash out. But then, to my surprise, he started talking. He told me about losing his job, about his wife leaving him and taking their kids, about the mounting bills and the crushing desperation that had driven him to this desperate act. As he spoke, I saw the man behind the mask, not a hardened criminal, but a person who had made a terrible mistake out of desperation. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me see him as human. Mike, I said gently when he finished, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. But this isn't the answer. You know that, right? It's not too late to fix this. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. How? I kidnapped you. I robbed a store at gunpoint. My life is over. I took a deep breath, hardly believing what I was about to say. Not if you end this now. Drive back to the store. Turn yourself in. I'll tell them you had a change of heart, that you let me go voluntarily. It won't erase what happened, but it will look a lot better than if they catch you later. Mike stared at me in disbelief. Why would you do that for me? After what I did to you? I shrugged. Because I believe people deserve second chances, and because I think, deep down, you're not a bad person. You just made a really bad choice. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he whispered. Okay, let's go back. The drive back to the store felt surreal. As we pulled into the parking lot, now filled with police cars and onlookers, Mike turned to me. Thank you, he said softly. I'm so sorry for everything. I watched as he got out of the car, hands raised, and walked towards the police. As promised, I told them he had changed his mind and brought me back voluntarily. It didn't erase what he'd done, but I hoped it might make a difference in how he was treated. As the adrenaline of the night finally began to wear off, I found myself wrapped in a shock blanket, answering questions from detectives and being fussed over by paramedics. My mom arrived, tears streaming down her face as she hugged me tightly. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to process what had happened. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and I jumped at every sudden noise. But I also found myself thinking about Mike, hoping that he would get the help he needed to turn his life around. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I learned about the strength I had inside me, about the power of empathy even in the face of fear, and I realized that sometimes the line between right and wrong, between victim and perpetrator, isn't as clear as we might think. As I sit here now, back behind the counter at Jerry's Gas and Go, with much improved security measures, I can't help but reflect on how a single night can alter the course of multiple lives. I don't know what the future holds for Mike or for me, but I do know this. In the darkest moments, a little compassion can light the way back to humanity. And sometimes, the most unexpected encounters can teach us the most profound lessons about ourselves and others. The neon sign of the Starlight Diner flickered weakly in the pre-dawn darkness, a beacon of light on an otherwise deserted stretch of highway. I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, my stomach growling after hours of driving. As I pushed open the glass door, the bell jingled, announcing my arrival to the handful of patrons scattered throughout the worn booths. Something felt off from the moment I stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, and every eye in the place turned to stare at me with an unsettling intensity. I should have trusted my gut and walked right back out. Instead, I slid into a booth and picked up a menu, unaware that I had just stepped into a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality and human nature. I'm not usually one for road trips, especially solo ones, but when my sister called, frantic about her impending divorce and begging me to come stay with her for a while, I couldn't say no. So here I was, halfway across the country, exhausted and in desperate need of caffeine and a greasy breakfast. The waitress approached my table, her pen poised over a small notepad. She was older, probably in her 60s, with faded red hair piled atop her head in a messy bun. Her name tag read, Dolores. "What'll it be, hun?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of cigarettes. "Just coffee for now, please," I replied, still perusing the menu. "I need a minute to decide on food." Dolores nodded and shuffled off towards the kitchen. As I looked around the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The other customers, a middle-aged couple, a trucker type, and a young woman sitting alone at the counter, all seemed to be watching me out of the corners of their eyes. When Dolores returned with my coffee, I decided to try and lighten the mood. "Quiet night?" I asked with a smile. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Night's over, honey. It's almost morning." I chuckled nervously. "Right, of course. I guess I lost track of time on the road." Dolores didn't laugh. She just stared at me for a long moment before asking, "You ready to order?" Unnerved, I quickly scanned the menu. Yeah, I'll have the breakfast special, please." As she walked away, I heard hushed whispers from the other patrons. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the furtive glances in my direction made it clear I was the topic of conversation. I sipped my coffee, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Long hours of driving could do that to a person, right? But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The clock on the wall was moving backward. I blinked hard. Sure, I must be hallucinating from fatigue. But no. The second hand was definitely ticking counterclockwise. I pulled out my phone to check the time, only to find that it had no signal and the clock was frozen at 3:33 a.m. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell was going on here? I was about to get up and leave when Dolores returned with my food. The plate she set in front of me contained not the eggs and bacon I had ordered, but a writhing mass of something. It pulsed and squirmed, emitting a faint, high-pitched keening sound. I recoiled in horror, knocking over my coffee mug in the process. What is this?" I gasped. Dolores smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Her teeth seemed too sharp, her eyes too bright. "It's what you ordered, dear, the breakfast special." I stood up so quickly I banged my knees on the table. "I'm leaving," I announced, my voice shaking. "I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but I want no part of it." As I turned to go, I found my path blocked by the other patrons. They had all left their seats and were now forming a tight circle around my booth. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes glazed and unfocused. The trucker spoke, his voice unnaturally deep. "You can't leave. Nobody leaves the Starlight Diner." I backed away, my heart pounding. "What do you want from me?" The young woman from the counter stepped forward. When she opened her mouth to speak, I saw that her tongue was forked like a snake's. "We want you to join us," she hissed, "to become part of the Starlight family." "No," I said, shaking my head vigorously. "No, this isn't real. I'm dreaming. I must have fallen asleep at the wheel." The middle-aged man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, this is very real. More real than anything you've ever known." They began to advance on me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I looked around frantically for a way out, but the door I had entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall. In desperation, I grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the window. Instead of shattering, the glass rippled like water, absorbing the impact. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Just let me go. I won't tell anyone about this place. I swear." Dolores appeared beside me, placing a gnarled hand on my shoulder. Her touch was ice cold. "Don't fight it, honey. It's easier if you don't fight." As they closed in around me, the world began to shift and warp. The diner's walls melted away, revealing an endless void dotted with strange, pulsating lights. The floor beneath my feet became insubstantial, and I felt myself beginning to sink. In that moment of pure terror, something inside me snapped. With a strength born of desperation, I shoved past the circle of not quite human figures and ran. I ran towards where the door should have been, my mind focused on a single thought: escape. Suddenly, I was falling. The void rushed past me, those alien lights streaking by like stars in a sci-fi movie. I screamed, but no sound came out. I fell for what felt like an eternity, certain that at any moment I would hit bottom and shatter into a million pieces. Then, abruptly, I wasn't falling anymore. I was standing in the Starlight Diner's parking lot, gasping for air, my clothes soaked with sweat. The sky was lightening with the first rays of dawn, and birds were beginning to chirp in the nearby trees. I spun around, half expecting to see the diner's patrons pursuing me. But the building stood silent and dark, its windows reflecting the pale morning light. The neon sign was off, and a faded Haferlisum sign hung in the front window. On shaky legs, I made my way to my car and all but fell into the driver's seat. My phone buzzed to life, suddenly full of missed calls and texts from my sister, wondering where I was. The clock read 6:17 a.m. As I started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, I couldn't stop shaking. What had happened in there? Had any of it been real? The rational part of my brain insisted it must have been a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But a deeper part of me knew better. The Starlight Diner had been real, and whatever dwelled within its walls was far beyond my comprehension. I drove nonstop to my sister's house, fueled by adrenaline and fear. When I finally arrived, I broke down in her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Through my tears, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to my own ears. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to make sense of my experience. I researched the area where I had stopped, looking for any mention of the Starlight Diner or similar strange occurrences. I found nothing concrete, but there were whispers on obscure forums of other travelers who had encountered places that didn't quite fit into reality. Liminal spaces where the laws of physics and nature didn't quite apply. I never drove that stretch of highway again. In fact, I avoided long road trips altogether, too afraid of what I might find in those lonely places between destinations. The experience left me with a profound sense of unease about the nature of reality. What other impossible things might be hiding just out of sight, waiting for an unwary traveler to stumble upon them? Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of the Starlight Diner. I see Dolores' too-sharp smile and hear the keening of that writhing breakfast special. I wake up in a cold sweat, relieved to find myself in my own bed, but unable to shake the feeling that a part of me is still there, trapped in that place between worlds. I've never told this story to anyone but my sister. Who would believe me? But I write it down now as a warning to others. If you're driving late at night and you see a diner where one shouldn't be, keep going. Don't stop, no matter how tired or hungry you are, because some places aren't meant for human eyes, and some meals come at a price too high to pay. And if you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, where time moves strangely and reality seems to bend, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and pray that whatever lies beyond the veil of our mundane world doesn't decide to follow you home. The moment I realized Tom had taken a wrong turn, a chill ran down my spine. We'd been carpooling to work for months, and he'd never deviated from our usual route. But as unfamiliar streets rolled by and the city faded behind us, I knew something was terribly wrong. I glanced at Tom, hoping to see confusion on his face, a sign that this was just a simple mistake. Instead, I saw a cold determination in his eyes that made my blood run cold. In that instant, I understood that the man I thought I knew, the coworker I'd trusted, was a stranger, and I was trapped in a car with him, heading towards God knows where. I've always been cautious by nature. Growing up in a rough neighborhood taught me to keep my guard up, to trust my instincts. So when the new guy at work, Tom, suggested we carpool to save on gas, I was hesitant. But after weeks of pleasant small talk in the break room and his easygoing demeanor, I decided to give it a shot. For 3 months, everything was fine. Tom was punctual, a good driver, and our morning conversations made the commute fly by. I even started to consider him a friend. That all changed on a Tuesday morning in late September. The day started like any other. Tom picked me up at 7:15, right on schedule. We chatted about the unseasonably warm weather and a big project coming up at work. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It wasn't until we'd been driving for about 20 minutes that I noticed something was off. The familiar landmarks of our usual route were nowhere to be seen. Instead of the bustling city streets, we were surrounded by increasingly rural scenery. "Hey, Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "I think you might have missed a turn back there." He didn't respond, didn't even glance in my direction, just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. That's when the first tendrils of real fear began to creep in. "Tom," I tried again, louder this time. "Where are we going?" Finally, he spoke, his voice flat and emotionless. "We're taking a little detour." My heart began to race. I reached for my phone, only to find my pocket empty. With a sinking feeling, I remembered leaving it on the kitchen counter to charge. "I'd like to get out now, please," I said, fighting to keep the panic out of my voice. Tom's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "That's not going to happen." I considered my options. We were moving too fast for me to safely jump out, even if I could get the door open. I had no phone to call for help, and I had no idea where we were or where we were headed. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, hoping to appeal to whatever shred of humanity might be left in him. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because you saw something you shouldn't have." My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. What could I possibly have seen? I racked my brain, going over every interaction we'd had in the past few weeks. Then it hit me. Last Friday, I'd stayed late at the office to finish up some reports. On my way out, I'd seen Tom in the parking garage, talking to a man I didn't recognize. They'd been standing close, speaking in hushed tones. When they saw me, they quickly separated. Tom had waved casually, explaining that it was just an old friend he'd run into. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now... "Is this about that man in the garage?" I asked. "Tom, whatever's going on, we can figure it out. You don't have to do this." His jaw clenched. "You don't understand. There's no going back now." As we drove deeper into the countryside, my fear gave way to a sort of desperate clarity. I knew I had to do something, and fast. I began to take stock of my surroundings. The car doors were locked, but the windows were down slightly to let in the cool morning air. In the cup holder between us was Tom's travel mug, still half full of coffee. An idea began to form. It was risky, potentially deadly if it went wrong, but it was the only chance I had. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. Then, in one fluid motion, I grabbed Tom's coffee mug and flung the contents in his face. He cried out in pain and surprise, the car swerving wildly as his hands left the wheel. In the moment of chaos, I lunged for the steering wheel, yanking it hard to the right. The world spun around us as the car left the road, tires screeching. We plowed through a wooden fence and into a field, finally coming to a jolting stop as we hit a large tree. For a moment, everything was silent except for the hissing of the damaged engine and our ragged breathing. Then, moving on pure adrenaline, I fumbled with my seatbelt and tumbled out of the car. My legs were shaky, and I could feel warm blood trickling down my forehead from where I'd hit it on the dashboard. But I was alive, and I was free. I looked back at the car. Tom was slumped over the steering wheel, not moving. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might be dead. Then I saw his chest rise and fall. Part of me wanted to run, to put as much distance between myself and this nightmare as possible. But I couldn't leave him there, no matter what he'd done. I may have been fighting for my life, but I wasn't a murderer. I approached the driver's side cautiously. "Tom?" I called out. "Can you hear me?" He groaned, slowly lifting his head. His face was red from the coffee, and there was a nasty gash on his forehead. Our eyes met, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do it." Before I could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle made us both turn. A black SUV was speeding down the road towards us. Tom's eyes widened in panic. "Run!" he shouted. "You have to run! They're coming for both of us now." I hesitated for just a moment, torn between the instinct to flee and the nagging feeling that I was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. But as the SUV screeched to a halt and men in dark suits began to pile out, I knew I had no choice. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning and my legs pumping as I tore across the field towards a distant tree line. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. As I reached the edge of the woods, a gunshot rang out. I ducked instinctively, nearly losing my footing on the uneven ground. Another shot, closer this time. They were gaining on me. I plunged into the forest, branches whipping at my face as I weaved between the trees. I had no plan, no destination in mind. My only thought was to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and my pursuers as possible. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green maze of the forest. Eventually, my body betrayed me. My legs gave out, and I collapsed against a large oak tree, gasping for air. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had happened, a twig snapped nearby. I froze, hardly daring to breathe. "I know you're there," a voice called out. It wasn't Tom, or any of the men from the SUV. This voice was female, authoritative. "You can come out. You're safe now." Warily, I peered around the tree. A woman in a dark suit stood a few yards away, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. Behind her, I could see other figures moving through the trees, all dressed similarly. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out, my throat raw from exertion. "Agent Sarah Reeves, FBI," she replied. "We've been tracking Tom and his associates for months. You're lucky we got here when we did." My head spun with questions. FBI, associates. What had I stumbled into? Over the next few hours, as I was checked over by paramedics and debriefed by Agent Reeves, the full story came out. Tom wasn't just a mild-mannered office worker. He was part of a sophisticated corporate espionage ring, stealing trade secrets and selling them to the highest bidder. When I'd seen him in the garage that night, he'd been making a drop to a buyer. "We think he panicked," Agent Reeves explained. "Thought you might have overheard something incriminating. He was probably planning to take you to his handlers for questioning." I shuddered at the implication. In the days and weeks that followed, my life became a whirlwind of police statements, FBI interviews, and sleepless nights. Tom and several of his associates were arrested, but the investigation was ongoing. I was placed in protective custody. My family and friends told I'd gone on an extended business trip. As I sit here now, in a safe house somewhere in the Midwest, I can't help but reflect on how quickly life can change. One moment, you're on your way to work, thinking about deadlines and office politics. The next, you're running for your life through the woods, your entire world turned upside down. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again, or if I'll be able to trust my instincts the way I once did. But I do know this. Sometimes, the most ordinary days can turn into the most extraordinary adventures. And sometimes, the people we think we know best are the ones capable of surprising us the most. So the next time you get into a car with someone, even someone you think you know well, take a moment to really look at them. You never know what secrets might be hiding behind a friendly smile. The attic door creaked open, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed. My wife, Sarah, and I had been exploring our new home, reveling in the excitement of first-time homeowners. But as we ascended the narrow stairs to what we thought was just storage space, we found ourselves standing in a fully furnished room, untouched for what looked like decades. Dust motes danced in the beam of our flashlight, and the air was thick with the musty smell of neglect. But it wasn't the antique furniture or yellowed newspapers that made my blood run cold. It was the wall of photographs, hundreds of them, showing people in various states of distress, and the large map in the center, with red pins marking locations all over our quiet suburban neighborhood. In that moment, I realized we hadn't just bought a house. We had stumbled upon the lair of someone who had been watching our community for years, and now we were part of their twisted game. I've always been a bit of a fixer-upper enthusiast. The idea of taking something old and neglected and breathing new life into it has always appealed to me. So when Sarah and I found this charming Victorian on the outskirts of town, priced well below market value due to its need for extensive renovations, I was thrilled. Sarah was more hesitant, but I convinced her with visions of original hardwood floors and stained glass windows. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of cleaning, painting, and making plans for bigger renovations. We'd explored most of the house, marveling at hidden features like the servant's staircase and the old coal chute. But somehow, we'd overlooked the pull-down stairs to the attic, assuming it was just unfinished space. Now, standing in this hidden room, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty old house. "John," Sarah whispered, her grip on my arm tightening. "What is this place?" I shook my head, unable to form words. My eyes were drawn to the photographs. Men, women, children, all candid shots taken without the subject's knowledge. Some showed people in their homes, others on the street or in parks. But the expressions were always the same: fear, pain, desperation. Sarah moved closer to the map, her hand covering her mouth in horror. "These are all places in town. Look, there's the school, the park, the grocery store." I nodded, my mind racing. Who had done this? How long had they been watching? And most importantly, were they still active? As if in answer to my unspoken question, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Among the older, faded photographs was a newer one. The paper was crisp, the colors vibrant, and the subjects were unmistakable. Sarah and I, standing on the front porch of this very house, on the day we got the keys. "But we need to call the police," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Sarah nodded, already pulling out her phone, but as she raised it to dial, her face fell. "No signal," she muttered. Of course, the thick walls of the old house had always made cell reception spotty at best. "Let's go downstairs," I suggested, trying to keep my voice calm. "We'll use the landline." We turned to leave, but something caught my eye: a floorboard, slightly raised, as if it had been pried up recently. Against my better judgment, I knelt down to investigate. "John, what are you doing?" Sarah hissed. "We need to get out of here." Just give me a second," I replied, working my fingers under the edge of the board. It came up easily, revealing a small space underneath. And there, nestled in the darkness, was a leather-bound journal. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it to a random page and began to read. June 15th, 1985. Subject 47 continues to display signs of distress. The loss of his wife has left him vulnerable. Recommend increasing surveillance and considering direct intervention. I flipped to another page. March 3rd, 1992. New family moved into 1478 Elm Street. 2 adults, 1 child. Begin standard observation protocol. The entries went on and on, detailing the lives of countless people in cold, clinical terms. Some dated back decades, while others were as recent as last week. "This is insane," Sarah whispered, reading over my shoulder. It's like they've been studying the whole town. I nodded, a sickening realization dawning on me. Not just studying, look at some of these later entries. Direct intervention, scenario implementation. They're not just watching, they're manipulating people's lives. A loud creak from downstairs made us both freeze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart pounding. We hadn't told anyone we were coming up here. We hadn't even known this room existed until a few minutes ago. So who could be in the house? Moving as quietly as possible, we crept towards the attic stairs. I went first, gesturing for Sarah to stay close behind me. As we descended, I strained my ears for any sound of movement. We had just reached the second-floor landing when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming up the main staircase. In a split-second decision, I pulled Sarah into the nearest room, our bedroom, and quietly shut the door. We pressed ourselves against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped right outside our door. For a heart-stopping moment, I was sure the person on the other side would hear the thundering of my pulse. Then, mercifully, the steps continued down the hall. We heard the creak of the attic stairs being lowered, then more footsteps ascending. "We have to get out of here," I whispered to Sarah. "Now." She nodded, her face pale with fear. Slowly, carefully, we opened the bedroom door and made our way towards the stairs. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. We had just reached the bottom of the stairs when a voice called out from above. "I know you're there." The voice was calm, almost friendly. But there was an undercurrent of menace that made my skin crawl. "I see you found my little project," the voice continued. I had so hoped to keep it private for a while longer. But well, I suppose it's time we had a chat. Footsteps again, coming down the attic stairs. Sarah tugged at my arm, her eyes wide with panic. But I was frozen in place, unable to move as the owner of the voice came into view. It was our next-door neighbor, Mr. Johnson, the kindly old man who had brought us a welcome pie when we first moved in, who had offered to help with our renovations, who had a key to our house in case of emergencies. He smiled at us, but it didn't reach his eyes. In his hand was a small notebook, similar to the one we had found in the attic. "Now then," he said, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "Let's talk about your role in all of this, shall we?" What followed was a nightmare of revelations. Mr. Johnson, it turned out, was part of a long-standing sociological experiment. For generations, his family and others like them had been observing and manipulating the town, treating its residents like lab rats in some grand, twisted study. "We've learned so much," he explained, his eyes gleaming with a fervor that bordered on madness. "About human nature, about society, about the very fabric of reality itself. And now, you two get to be part of it all." I wanted to run, to scream, to fight. But I knew that any sudden moves could end very badly for us. So instead, I played for time. "Why us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why this house?" Mr. Johnson's smile widened. "Oh, you were chosen very carefully. Your profiles matched exactly what we needed for our next phase. And this house? Well, let's just say it's been at the center of our work for a very long time." As he spoke, I noticed Sarah inching towards the side table where we kept a heavy marble paperweight. I kept Mr. Johnson talking, asking questions about the project, about the town's history, anything to keep his attention on me. "It's fascinating, really," I said, taking a small step forward. "I'd love to hear more about your methods. How do you decide who to intervene with?" Mr. Johnson's eyes lit up. He loved talking about his work, that much was clear. As he launched into a detailed explanation of their selection criteria, Sarah's hand closed around the paperweight. What happened next was a blur. Sarah swung the paperweight with all her might, catching Mr. Johnson on the side of the head. He went down hard, the notebook falling from his grasp. We didn't wait to see if he would get up. We ran out the front door and into the night, not stopping until we reached the police station several blocks away. The aftermath was chaotic. Police swarmed our house and Mr. Johnson's. More hidden rooms were found, more records uncovered. It turned out the conspiracy went deeper than we could have imagined, involving key figures in local government, law enforcement, even medical professionals. Sarah and I were questioned for hours, then placed in protective custody. We learned that similar operations had been uncovered in other towns across the country. A nationwide investigation was underway. As I sit here now, in a safe house hundreds of miles from the place we once called home, I can't help but wonder how much of our lives has been manipulated, how many of our choices were really our own. The world feels different now, less solid somehow. Every friendly face could be hiding sinister intentions. Every coincidence could be part of some grand design. But amidst all the uncertainty, one thing remains clear. Sarah and I faced this nightmare together, and we'll face whatever comes next the same way. In a world where nothing is as it seems, our bond is the one thing I know is real. As for the house, and the secrets it still might hold, sometimes I think it's better not to know. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The first time I noticed him, I dismissed it as coincidence. A tall man in a dark jacket, his face obscured by a baseball cap, walking about 50 yards behind me on my usual jogging route through the park. But by the third day, as I rounded the old oak tree and saw him matching my pace in the distance, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. I picked up my speed, heart pounding, and took a sharp turn onto a less frequented path. As I glanced back, my blood ran cold. He had changed course too, closing the gap between us with long, purposeful strides. In that moment, I realized this was no coincidence. The park I had always seen as my sanctuary had become a hunting ground, and I was the prey. I've always been a creature of habit. Same coffee order every morning, same route to work, same jogging path through Oakwood Park every evening at 6 p.m. sharp. It's a routine that served me well for years, helping me balance the stress of my job as a high school counselor with my need for physical activity and fresh air. The park had always felt safe. Families picnicking on the grassy lawns, elderly couples feeding ducks by the pond, other joggers and dog walkers nodding friendly greetings as we passed each other. It was my slice of nature in the bustling city, a place where I could clear my head and feel at peace. But now, as I veered off my usual path and onto a narrow trail that wound through a more densely wooded area, that sense of security shattered like glass. I pushed myself harder, my feet pounding the dirt path as I wove between the trees. The sound of my own ragged breathing filled my ears, punctuated by the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my sneakers. I resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on putting as much distance as possible between myself and my pursuer. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the woods and onto a more open area of the park. A group of teenagers was playing frisbee on a nearby field. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Surely he wouldn't try anything with witnesses around. But as I slowed my pace and turned to look behind me, my heart sank. The man was gone. Had I lost him in the woods? Or was he simply biding his time, waiting for a more opportune moment? I joined a group of people waiting to cross at a busy intersection, trying to blend in while scanning my surroundings. That's when I saw him again, standing at a bus stop across the street. His eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The light changed, and I moved with the crowd, my mind racing. I couldn't go home. What if he followed me there? I needed to get somewhere public, somewhere safe. I ducked into a busy coffee shop, ordered a water I didn't really want, and sank into a chair near the back, my body trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. As I sipped the water and tried to calm my nerves, I pulled out my phone and called my best friend Elisa. "Hey, what's up?" she answered cheerfully. Lisa, I said, my voice shaking. I need help. I think someone's following me. I could hear the shift in her tone immediately. What? Are you okay? Where are you? I explained the situation as best I could, describing the man and his persistent presence over the past few days. Okay, stay where you are, Lisa said firmly. I'm coming to get you. Have you called the police? I hesitated. No, I'm not sure they'd do anything. I mean, he hasn't actually done anything, right? Just walked in the same park as me. Better safe than sorry, Lisa insisted. Call them. I'll be there in 15 minutes. After hanging up, I dialed the non-emergency police number with shaking fingers. The dispatcher took my information and said they'd send an officer to take a statement. As I waited, I kept a wary eye on the coffee shop's entrance. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my heart leaped into my throat. But there was no sign of the man in the dark jacket. Lisa arrived before the police, enveloping me in a tight hug before sitting down across from me. Have you seen him since you got here? She asked, her eyes scanning the shop. I shook my head. No, but Lisa, I'm scared. What if he knows where I live? What if he's been watching me for longer than I realized? She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We'll figure this out. You can stay with me for a few days if you want, and we'll make sure the police take this seriously. When the officer arrived, he listened to my story with a neutral expression that I couldn't quite read. Was he taking me seriously, or did he think I was overreacting? Have you noticed any other unusual occurrences lately? He asked. Hang-up calls, strange letters, anything out of the ordinary at work? I thought hard, then shook my head. No, nothing like that. It's just been in the park. The officer nodded, jotting something in his notebook. Well, Miss Chen, without any direct threats or actions, there's not much we can do at this point, but we'll increase patrols in the park, and I want you to call immediately if you see this individual again or if anything else happens that makes you uncomfortable. It wasn't exactly the response I'd hoped for, but I understood. What could they do? Arrest a man for walking in a public park? Over the next few days, I stayed with Lisa, too afraid to return to my own apartment. I took a few days off work, using some of my accumulated sick time. When I did venture out, it was never alone, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I found myself jumping at shadows, convinced that every person in a dark coat or baseball cap was my stalker. Sleep became elusive, my nights filled with nightmares of being chased through endless dark woods. A week after the incident in the park, I decided it was time to reclaim my life. I couldn't live in fear forever. So, with Lisa by my side, I returned to my jogging routine. The familiar path felt different now, tainted by fear and suspicion. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch, every distant figure a potential threat. But as we completed the circuit without incident, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it had all been a misunderstanding. Maybe the man had just been another jogger with a similar routine to mine. That hope was short-lived. As Lisa and I neared the exit of the park, I saw him, standing by the gate, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on me. This time, there was no mistaking his intent. Lisa, I whispered, gripping her arm. That's him. By the gate. She looked where I was pointing, and her eyes widened. Without a word, she pulled out her phone and started recording. The man began to walk towards us, his pace quickening with each step. My heart raced, every instinct screaming at me to run. But Lisa stood her ground, her phone held steady. "Stay back," she shouted as he drew closer. "We're calling the police." He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket. I braced myself, certain he was about to pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a small, leather-bound notebook. "Alexis Chen," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "I've been trying to find the right moment to approach you." I stared at him, confusion mingling with fear. "Who are you?" What do you want from me?" He opened the notebook, revealing a photograph paperclipped to one of the pages. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the image. My mother, decades younger, smiling at the camera. "My name is David Reeves," he said. "I'm a private investigator. Your mother hired me to find you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. My mother, the woman who had given me up for adoption as an infant, whom I'd never known. I don't understand," I stammered. David's expression softened. "She's very ill, Alexis. She wanted to find you before." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. As the adrenaline began to fade, I felt lightheaded. Lisa put a steadying arm around my shoulders. "Why didn't you just approach me normally?" I asked, anger beginning to replace fear. "Do you have any idea how terrified I've been?" David had the grace to look ashamed. "I'm sorry. I've been doing this job for a long time, and sometimes I forget how my actions might appear to others. I wanted to observe you first, to make sure I had the right person before making contact. I should have handled it differently." In the days that followed, my world turned upside down. After verifying David's story and credentials, I found myself grappling with a decision I never thought I'd have to make, whether to meet the mother who had given me up all those years ago. The fear that had consumed me for the past week transformed into a different kind of anxiety. As I sit here now, staring at a phone number that could connect me to my biological mother, I can't help but reflect on how quickly life can change. A simple jog in the park led to a week of terror, which in turn led to a revelation that could reshape my entire identity. I don't know what I'll say if I make that call, or what kind of relationship, if any, might come from it. But I do know this. The experience has taught me that sometimes the things we fear most can lead us to unexpected truths about ourselves and our past. As for my jogging routine, well, let's just say I've found a new appreciation for treadmills and well-lit gym tracks. Some habits, it turns out, are worth breaking, especially when they lead you into the path of life-altering discoveries. The electricity flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire apartment into darkness. I froze, my hand still on the refrigerator door, as the sudden silence engulfed me. The low hum of appliances, the distant murmur of the TV I'd left on for company, all gone in an instant. I fumbled for my phone, cursing as I remembered it was charging in the bedroom. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, a sound made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside my home. I wasn't alone, and whoever was here had chosen the perfect moment to strike. I've never been a fan of the dark. As a kid, I insisted on a nightlight well into my teens, much to my older brother's amusement. Even as an adult, I sleep with a small lamp on in the corner of my bedroom. But this darkness was different, oppressive, almost alive with menace. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, straining my ears for any sound. The footsteps had stopped, but I could sense a presence, someone or something waiting in the shadows. My mind raced through possibilities. A burglar taking advantage of the blackout, a neighbor who'd somehow gotten into the wrong apartment, or something far worse, a nightmare come to life in the pitch black of my own home. Slowly, carefully, I eased the refrigerator door closed, wincing at the soft thud it made. I needed to get to my phone to call for help, but to reach my bedroom, I'd have to cross the living room, the same direction the footsteps had come from. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I knew my apartment layout like the back of my hand. If I could just make it to the hallway without making a sound, I might have a chance. I slid my hand along the kitchen counter, using it as a guide in the darkness. My fingers brushed against something metallic. The heavy cast-iron skillet I'd used to make dinner earlier. I gripped it tightly, the weight of it oddly comforting in my hand. As I inched my way towards the living room, A floorboard creaked under my foot. I froze, holding my breath. For a moment, nothing. Then, a soft shuffle, closer this time. My intruder was on the move. Panic surged through me. Abandoning stealth, I bolted for the hallway. I heard a startled exclamation behind me, followed by the sound of someone giving chase. I slammed into the wall at the end of the hall, disoriented by the darkness, but managed to find my bedroom door. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and fumbling for the lock. Just as I heard it click into place, a body thudded against the other side. The door shuddered in its frame as my pursuer tried to force their way in. My hands shaking, I groped in the darkness for my phone. Where was it? I always left it on the nightstand to charge. Had I moved it, the pounding on the door grew more insistent, the wood beginning to splinter. Finally, my fingers closed around the familiar shape of my phone. I snatched it up, nearly sobbing with relief as the screen flickered to life. The harsh blue light illuminated the room, momentarily blinding me. As my vision cleared, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, reflected in the mirror across from my bed, was a figure. Not at the door where the pounding continued, but inside the room with me. I whirled around, raising the skillet I'd somehow managed to hold on to. The figure lunged at me, and I swung blindly. There was a sickening crunch as the pan connected with something solid, followed by a grunt of pain. The pounding at the door stopped abruptly. "Sarah?" A familiar voice called out. "Sarah, are you okay? It's me, Jack." Jack? My neighbor from across the hall? What was he doing here? Before I could respond, the figure I'd hit let out a low moan. In the dim light from my phone, I could see them sprawled on the floor, clutching their head. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What are you doing in my apartment?" The person on the floor looked up at me and I gasped. It was a woman, probably around my age, with a nasty gash on her forehead where I'd hit her. "Please," she whispered, her voice filled with fear. "Please don't hurt me. I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was home." Confusion warred with fear inside me. "What are you talking about? This is my home." The woman's eyes widened. "No," she said slowly. This is my apartment. 4B, I just moved in last week." My mind reeled. That wasn't possible. I'd lived in 4B for over 2 years. "Sarah?" Jack called again from the hallway. I heard a crash. "Do you need me to call the police?" I don't know," I replied, my eyes still fixed on the woman on my bedroom floor. "There's someone in here with me, but something's not right." I heard Jack fumbling with something, and then a beam of light shone under the door. A flashlight. "I'm coming in, okay? Don't be scared." The door swung open, and Jack's familiar face appeared in the flashlight's glow. He took in the scene, me standing with a raised skillet, the injured woman on the floor, the general disarray of the room, with wide eyes. "What the hell happened here?" he asked. "She says this is her apartment," I said, gesturing to the woman. "But that's impossible. I've lived here for years." Jack's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sarah," he said gently, "this isn't your apartment. You live in 4A, remember? Across the hall." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "What? No, that's not right. This is my place. My bed, my things." But as I looked around the room, illuminated now by both my phone and Jack's flashlight, doubt began to creep in. The furniture was similar to mine, yes, but not exactly the same. The pictures on the wall were unfamiliar. And there, on the dresser, was a framed photo of the woman on the floor, smiling with a group of friends I'd never seen before. "I don't understand," I mumbled, the skillet slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. "How did I get here? Why did I think—" Jack approached me slowly, as if afraid I might bolt. "Sarah, remember what Dr. Patel said about your episodes? Sometimes when you're stressed or tired, you can get confused, mix up memories." "Episodes?" Dr. Patel? The names stirred something in my mind, but it was like trying to grasp at smoke. The woman on the floor sat up gingerly, still holding her head. "I'm so sorry," she said. "When I heard someone in the apartment, I thought it was a burglar. I hid in here and called the building manager. He must have called you," she added, looking at Jack. Jack nodded. "I'm on the tenant board. They call me for emergencies sometimes." He turned back to me. "Sarah, why don't we go back to your place? I think you need to rest." As if in a daze, I let Jack lead me out of the apartment. In the hallway, emergency lights cast an eerie glow. Other neighbors were poking their heads out, curious about the commotion. My real apartment, was indeed across the hall. As Jack unlocked the door, how did he have a key? Memories started to trickle back. The move 6 months ago after my accident. The doctor's appointments. The medication that sometimes left me feeling foggy and disoriented. Inside, Jack sat me down on the couch and went to find some candles. As the warm light filled the room, I felt tears begin to stream down my face. "It happened again, didn't it?" I asked, my voice small and scared. Jack nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and sympathy. "Yeah, it did. But it's okay. You're safe now." As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion hit me like a wave. Jack called Dr. Patel, explaining what had happened in hushed tones. I caught phrases like increasing dosage and more frequent check-ins. When he hung up, Jack turned to me with a gentle smile. "The doctor says you should try to get some sleep. I'll stay here tonight, okay? Just in case." I nodded, too tired to argue. As I curled up on the couch, Jack's reassuring presence nearby, I couldn't shake the lingering fear and confusion. How many more times would this happen? Would there come a day when I couldn't find my way back to reality? The power came back on sometime in the night, the sudden brightness startling me awake. Jack was dozing in the armchair, the gentle rise and fall of his chest oddly comforting. I lay there, watching the familiar shadows of my real apartment play across the walls. Tomorrow, I'd have to face the consequences of my episode, apologize to my new neighbor, probably face more tests and therapy sessions. But for now, in this moment of clarity, I made a silent promise to myself. I would fight this. I would find a way to anchor myself in reality, to distinguish between what was real and what my injured brain conjured up. Because the true horror, I realized, wasn't the imagined intruder in the dark. It was the fear of losing myself, of never being sure if what I was experiencing was real or just another cruel trick of my mind. As dawn began to break, casting a soft glow through the windows, I closed my eyes and tried to memorize every detail of this moment. This was real. This was home. And no matter how dark things got, I would always find my way back here. The cabin key felt unnaturally heavy in my hand as I stood before the weather-beaten door. I'd driven for hours to reach this secluded spot, desperate for a week of solitude to finish my novel. But as I inserted the key into the lock, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp mountain air. Something was off. The door swung open with an ominous creak, revealing an interior that looked nothing like the cozy retreat I'd seen in the online listing. Dust-covered sheets draped the furniture like shrouds, and the musty smell of long abandonment filled my nostrils. My writer's imagination kicked into overdrive, conjuring images of what might be lurking in the shadows. Little did I know, the horrors my mind invented would pale in comparison to the truth I was about to uncover. I've always been a city girl at heart. The idea of spending a week alone in the woods had seemed romantic when I booked the cabin, a perfect setting to break through my writer's block and finally finish the thriller that had been consuming my life for the past year. But standing in that gloomy living room, I was starting to regret my decision. "Get a grip, Megan," I muttered to myself, shaking off the feeling of unease. I was just tired from the long drive, That's all. A good night's sleep, and this place would look much better in the morning light. I dragged my suitcase inside and began exploring the cabin. It was larger than I'd expected, with 2 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a back porch that offered a stunning view of the surrounding forest. Despite the layer of dust and neglect, I could see the potential for coziness. As I was unpacking in the master bedroom, something caught my eye. A corner of the faded wallpaper was peeling away from the wall. Curious, I tugged at it gently. To my surprise, a large section came away easily, revealing what looked like scratch marks underneath. My heart began to race as I peeled away more of the paper. The marks formed words, crudely carved into the wooden wall. "They're watching. Don't trust the trees." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What the hell was this? Some kind of sick joke left by previous guests. I forced myself to take a deep breath. There had to be a logical explanation. Kids playing pranks, maybe, or the delusions of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. I was a writer, for God's sake. I should be able to come up with a dozen rational explanations, but as I turned to leave the room, movement outside the window caught my eye. I froze, my gaze locked on the tree line at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw something shift among the shadows of the forest, something that didn't move like any animal I knew. I shook my head, trying to clear it. The long drive and the spooky atmosphere of the cabin were clearly getting to me. I needed food, a hot shower, and sleep in that order. The kitchen was better stocked than I'd expected, with canned goods and other non-perishables lining the shelves. I managed to cobble together a simple meal, all the while trying to ignore the growing sense of being watched. After dinner, I decided a nice hot shower would help calm my nerves. The bathroom was small but functional, with an old clawfoot tub that had seen better days. As I let the warm water wash over me, I began to relax. Maybe this place wasn't so bad after all. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from somewhere behind the walls. I shut off the water, straining my ears. There it was again, louder this time. It sounded like claws or fingers. I jumped out of the shower, hastily wrapping a towel around myself. The scratching continued, seeming to move around the room. Then, abruptly, it stopped, heart pounding. I pressed my ear against the wall where I'd last heard the sound. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, so faint I almost missed it, a whisper. "Welcome home." I recoiled as if I'd been burned, nearly slipping on the wet floor in my haste to get out of the bathroom. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I ran to the bedroom, threw on some clothes, and grabbed my phone. No signal, of course. I was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and mountains that blocked any hope of cell reception. As I stood there, debating whether to jump in my car and drive back to civilization, a loud thud from the living room made me jump. It sounded like something heavy had fallen. Against my better judgment, I crept towards the sound. In the dim light of the setting sun streaming through the windows, I saw that one of the bookshelves had toppled over. Books and trinkets were scattered across the floor. I approached cautiously, my eyes drawn to something that glinted among the debris. Kneeling down, I picked up what looked like an old locket. It was tarnished and dented, but as I turned it over in my hands, I managed to pry it open. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman. She looked eerily familiar, though I couldn't place why. As I stared at her face, a chill ran through me. Her eyes seemed to be looking not at the camera, but at something just beyond it, something that filled her with terror. A gust of wind suddenly blew through the room, making me gasp. But that was impossible. All the windows were closed. I spun around, my eyes darting to every shadow. The cabin suddenly felt much larger, the corners darker and deeper than they had any right to be. "Who's there?" I called out, hating how my voice shook. "This isn't funny." Silence answered me, but it was a loaded silence filled with the sense of something waiting, watching, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of here. I ran to the front door, yanking it open, only to find myself face to face with a solid wall of mist. It was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Panic clawed at my throat. I slammed the door shut and ran to the back porch. The same unnatural fog surrounded the cabin on all sides, as if it had been cut off from the rest of the world. As I stood there, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, coming from upstairs. But there was no upstairs. The cabin was a single-story building. I turned slowly, my eyes drawn to the ceiling. A dark stain was spreading across the wood, like water seeping through. But it wasn't water. It was too thick, too dark. A drop fell, landing on the floor with a sickening plop. Then another, and another. I backed away, my back hitting the porch railing. The drops were coming faster now, forming a puddle on the floor. As I watched in horror, the puddle began to move, to take shape. It rose up, forming a vaguely humanoid figure, featureless, save for two glowing points of light where eyes should be. Who? What are you? I managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head, an unsettlingly human gesture. When it spoke, its voice was like rustling leaves and creaking wood. "We are the forest," it said. "We are the Watchers, and you, Megan, are our newest guest." My mind reeled. How did it know my name? "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure moved closer, its form rippling like dark water. "This place, it calls to certain people, creative souls, imaginative minds. It feeds on your stories, your fears, your dreams." I shook my head, unwilling to accept what I was hearing. "No, this isn't real. It can't be." The creature let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "Oh, but it is. More real than you can imagine. And now that you're here, you'll never leave. Just like all the others." Suddenly, the walls of the cabin seemed to come alive. Faces pressed against the wood, mouths open in silent screams. I recognized one of them, the woman from the locket. "No!" I screamed, making a desperate dash for the front door. But as I reached for the handle, the wood warped and twisted, melting away like smoke. The mist outside was creeping in now, tendrils of it wrapping around my ankles. I could hear whispers in it, fragments of stories never finished, characters never fully formed. "Your story isn't over, Megan," the creature said from behind me. "It's only just beginning, and it will never ever end." As the mist engulfed me, I felt my sense of self beginning to slip away. My memories, my identity, all of it fading like a dream upon waking. The last thing I remember is the scratch of pen on paper, words flowing endlessly, stories pouring out of me, feeding the insatiable hunger of the forest. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has no meaning in this place. Sometimes I catch glimpses of new arrivals, wide-eyed writers or artists drawn to the solitude of the woods. I try to warn them, but my voice is just another whisper in the mist. So I write. I write to remember who I am. I write in the hopes that someone, somewhere, will read these words and understand the truth. If you're reading this, please, whatever you do, don't come looking for me. Don't try to find the cabin in the woods, because once you're here, you can never leave. And the forest is always watching, always hungry for new stories to consume. The last customer shuffled out of the 24-hour convenience store at 2:37 a.m., leaving me alone in the fluorescent-lit silence. I sighed, glancing at the clock. Just 3 more hours until my shift ended. As I began restocking the shelves, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Outside, a figure lingered by the gas pumps, face obscured by a hoodie. Something about their stance made my skin prickle. I told myself it was nothing, just another late-night wanderer. But as the minutes ticked by and they remained motionless, a knot of dread formed in my stomach. I reached for my phone, only to find the screen black and unresponsive. Dead battery. Of course. As I looked up, my heart nearly stopped. The figure was now at the door, hand on the handle. And in that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that this long, uneventful night was about to become a fight for survival. I've been working the graveyard shift at Jerry's Gas and Go for about 6 months now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it helps pay for college, and the quiet hours give me time to study. Most nights are predictably boring. The occasional drunk looking for more booze, truckers fueling up, and the regular parade of insomniacs and night owls. Tonight had been particularly slow. I'd spent most of my shift reading my biology textbook, looking forward to crawling into bed and catching a few hours of sleep before my 8 a.m. class. But as I watched the hooded figure enter the store, all thoughts of sleep and school evaporated. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the doorway. The hood cast deep shadows over his face, but I could feel his eyes on me, assessing, calculating. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" He didn't respond, just slowly moved further into the store. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was trapped behind the counter, the silent alarm button just out of reach. "We're about to close," I lied, hoping he'd leave. "So if you need anything, you should grab it quick." A low chuckle emanated from beneath the hood, sending chills down my spine. "Oh, I think you'll stay open for me." His hand emerged from his pocket, and my breath caught in my throat. The fluorescent lights glinted off the blade of a wicked-looking knife. "Now," he said, his voice eerily calm, "why don't you open that register for me?" My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. "Please," I stammered. "Just take the money and go. I won't call the police, I swear." He laughed again, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not just here for the money." As the cash drawer popped open, I risked a glance at the silent alarm. If I could just reach it. "Don't even think about it," he growled, as if reading my mind. "My hands where I can see them." I raised my hand slowly, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. What do you want?" He moved closer, and I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hood. His eyes were cold, calculating, with a glint of something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a robbery. This was something far worse. "What I want," he said softly, "is for you to come out from behind that counter. We're going for a little ride." Panic surged through me. If I left with him, I knew I'd never be seen again. In that moment of pure terror, survival instinct took over. I grabbed the hot coffee pot from the machine behind me and hurled it at him with all my might. He ducked, but not fast enough. The scalding liquid splashed across his face and chest. He roared in pain and anger, momentarily blinded. I vaulted over the counter, adrenaline lending me strength I didn't know I possessed. But as I raced for the door, I realized with horror that he was between me and the exit. Without thinking, I ran towards the back of the store. There had to be another way out. A back door. Something. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and fast. "You're gonna regret that, you little bitch." I darted down an aisle, knocking over displays in an attempt to slow him down. My eyes frantically scanned for anything I could use as a weapon. The stockroom. If I could get there, maybe I could barricade myself and find a phone, call for help. I reached the door and yanked it open, nearly sobbing with relief when I saw it wasn't locked. I slammed it shut behind me, my eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. Boxes and shelves filled the small room. No phone that I could see, and no other exit. I was trapped. The door shuddered as he slammed into it from the other side. It wouldn't hold for long. Desperate, I began pushing shelves in front of the door. Anything to buy myself more time. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. That's when I saw it. High up on the wall, a small window. It would be a tight squeeze, but it was my only chance. I dragged a heavy box beneath the window, wincing at the sound of splintering wood as the door began to give way. Just as I heard the door crash open, I hauled myself up and through the window. It was a longer drop to the ground than I'd expected, and I landed hard, pain shooting through my ankle, but I couldn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran, ignoring the throbbing in my ankle. The cool night air hit my face as I rounded the corner of the building, heading for the empty street. Where could I go? The nearest house was over a mile away. My car was still in the parking lot, but I'd left the keys inside. A car. I needed a car, as if in answer to my silent plea. Headlights appeared in the distance. A truck, approaching the gas station. I ran towards it, waving my arms frantically. "Help!" I screamed. "Please help me!" The truck slowed, and I could make out the confused face of the driver, an older man, probably a trucker stopping for coffee. Before I could reach him, I heard the sound of breaking glass behind me. He had gotten out through the window, too. "Don't stop," I yelled at the trucker. "Call the police. There's a man with a knife." The driver's eyes widened in understanding. He reached for something on the seat beside him, a phone, I hoped, as he accelerated past me. I turned to see my attacker emerging from behind the building. Even in the dim light of the street lamps, I could see the fury on his face, made all the more terrifying by the angry red burns from the coffee. He started towards me, knife glinting in his hand. Nowhere to run now, sweetheart. But he was wrong. I did have somewhere to run, somewhere he couldn't follow. I sprinted towards the highway, my lungs burning, my ankle screaming in protest. I could hear him behind me, closing the distance with his longer strides. The sound of an approaching vehicle made me risk a glance over my shoulder. Headlights coming fast, and flashing lights on top. The police. The trucker had called them. They were almost here. But my attacker was closer. I felt his hand grab my shirt, yanking me backwards. I screamed, twisting in his grip, fighting with everything I had. We grappled, his knife coming terrifyingly close to my face. I could smell the coffee on him, mixed with sweat and something metallic. Blood. The police car screeched to a halt nearby, doors flying open. "Freeze! Police!" In that moment of distraction, I managed to wrench myself free. I stumbled away, gasping for air, as the officers surrounded my attacker, guns drawn. What happened next was a blur. More police cars arrived, an ambulance, people asking me questions, wrapping me in a shock blanket. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I'd nearly died, if I hadn't fought back, if that trucker hadn't shown up when he did. The police told me later that my attacker was a serial killer they'd been hunting for months. He targeted female gas station attendants across 3 states, always during the night shift. I was the first one who'd managed to escape. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. But slowly, with the help of therapy and the unwavering support of my family and friends, I began to heal. I realized that I wasn't just a victim, I was a survivor. I had faced the worst kind of evil and come out alive. I never worked another night shift, but I did finish college. Now, years later, I work as a victim's advocate, helping others who have faced similar traumas. Sometimes, when I drive past a brightly lit gas station in the middle of the night, I think about that young girl I used to be, studying biology and dreaming of the future. I think about how close I came to losing everything, but mostly, I think about how strong we can be when we're pushed to our limits, how the will to survive can give us courage we never knew we had. And I hope that my story might help someone else find that strength within themselves, should they ever need it. Because in the darkest of nights, sometimes we're all we've got, and sometimes that's enough. The headlights of the car behind me flashed again, uncomfortably bright in my rearview mirror. I squinted, trying to focus on the dark, winding road ahead. For the past 20 minutes, this vehicle had been tailing me, matching my every turn on this desolate stretch of highway. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. After all, there weren't many routes through these mountains. But as the minutes ticked by and the car drew closer, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I was alone, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and a gas tank hovering dangerously close to empty. As I rounded another bend, the car suddenly accelerated, its front bumper now mere inches from my rear. In that heart-stopping moment, I realized this was no ordinary driver. This was a predator, and I was the prey. I've always loved road trips. There's something freeing about the open road, the endless possibilities of where you might end up. But this trip was different. I was running, though from what I couldn't quite say. A failed relationship, a dead-end job, the suffocating expectations of family and friends. All of it had become too much. So I packed a bag, jumped in my old Honda, and just left. For 3 days, I'd been driving with no real destination in mind. I'd watched cities give way to suburbs, suburbs to farmland, and farmland to the rugged wilderness of the mountains. It was exhilarating, this feeling of escape, of shedding my old life like a snake shedding its skin. But now, as I white-knuckled the steering wheel, that exhilaration had turned to dread. I pressed down on the accelerator, hoping to put some distance between myself and my pursuer. The Honda protested, the engine whining as I pushed it to speeds it was never designed for on these treacherous mountain roads. For a moment, it seemed to work. The headlights in my mirror grew slightly dimmer, but then, with a roar that cut through the quiet night, the other car surged forward again. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. There were no turnoffs, no safe places to stop. The sheer cliff face on one side and the steep drop on the other left no room for error. I glanced at my gas gauge, my heart sinking. The needle was now firmly on E. Even if I could outrun this maniac, I'd soon be stranded. That's when I saw it. A sign for a rest area, 1 mile ahead. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe there would be other people there, or at least a place to maneuver that didn't involve plummeting off a mountainside. I eased off the gas slightly, not wanting to overshoot the turn in the darkness. The car behind me took this as an invitation, edging even closer. I could now make out the grille in my mirror, a hulking mass of metal that seemed to grin malevolently at me. The rest area appeared suddenly, a small gravel lot with a single flickering light illuminating a sad-looking picnic table and a grungy bathroom building. No other cars, no help. I made the turn sharply, gravel spraying as I fishtailed into the lot. My pursuer was right on my tail, but in his eagerness to follow, he overshot the entrance. This was my chance. I cut the headlights and quickly pulled behind the bathroom building, out of sight from the road. I killed the engine, plunging everything into silence. For a long moment, the only sound was my ragged breathing and the tick-tick-tick of my car's cooling engine. Then I heard it, the rumble of a powerful engine, slowly approaching. I slid down in my seat, praying the darkness would conceal me. The other car pulled into the lot, its headlights sweeping across the empty space. It idled there for what felt like an eternity, as if its driver was considering his next move. Then, to my horror, I heard a car door open and close, footsteps on gravel, coming closer. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The footsteps paused, then changed direction, moving towards the bathroom building. A beam of light, a flashlight, played across the ground. "I know you're here," a voice called out. It was deep, with an odd sing-song quality that made my skin crawl. "Why don't you come out and we can have a nice chat?" I remained frozen, my mind screaming at me to run but my body refusing to cooperate. The flashlight beam swept closer, and I knew I was seconds away from being discovered. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I started my car. The engine roared to life, startling in the quiet night. I threw it into reverse, not even bothering to turn on the headlights. I heard a shout and saw the flashlight beam jerking wildly as its owner ran towards me. I hit the road and shifted into drive, my tires squealing as I accelerated. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man running back to his car. I had maybe a 30-second head start. I pushed my car to its limits, taking the curves faster than I'd ever dared before, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he caught up. My gas tank was running on fumes, and his car was clearly more powerful. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, my headlights illuminated something that made my heart leap, a turnoff, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel, plunging down the rough dirt road. Branches scraped against my car as I bounced along the uneven surface. I had no idea where this road led, but anything was better than the certain doom that awaited me on the highway. After what felt like miles but was probably only a few hundred yards, I came to a small clearing. An old, dilapidated cabin stood in the center, its windows dark and empty. I cut the engine and sat there, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. For a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime noises of the forest. Then faintly, I heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. Panic gripped me. I couldn't stay here. The road was too obvious. He'd find me in no time. But I couldn't go back to the highway either. That left only one option. I grabbed my phone and the small emergency kit I kept in the glove compartment, then slipped out of the car. The forest loomed before me, dark and foreboding, but it was my only chance. I plunged into the trees, using my phone's flashlight to guide my way. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to put as much distance between myself and that road as possible. I walked for what felt like hours, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous. My legs ached, and my lungs burned from the thin mountain air, but fear kept me moving. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the trees, I finally allowed myself to stop. I found a small hollow beneath a rocky overhang and collapsed, exhaustion overtaking me. When I awoke, the sun was high in the sky. For a moment, I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then the memories of the night came flooding back, and I felt a fresh wave of fear. I checked my phone, still no signal. The battery was at 20%, and I knew I needed to conserve it. I had no food, and only a small bottle of water in my emergency kit. I was well and truly lost in the wilderness. But as I sat there, considering my options, I realized something. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The immediate danger had passed, replaced by a more primal set of challenges. Finding food, water, shelter. It was terrifying, yes, but also strangely exhilarating. I thought about the life I'd left behind, the suffocating routine that had driven me to flee in the first place. And I made a decision. I wouldn't go back. Not yet. Anyway. I stood up, stretching my sore muscles, and looked out at the vast expanse of forest before me. Somewhere out there was civilization, safety, my old life. But for now, I would embrace this new adventure, this chance to rediscover who I really was beneath all the layers of societal expectations. As I set off into the unknown, a small smile played at my lips. The night had been a nightmare, but it had woken me from a much longer, more insidious one, the sleepwalking I'd been doing through my own life. I don't know what challenges await me in these mountains. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened on that dark highway, or who that man was and why he chased me. But I do know this. Sometimes, the most terrifying moments in our lives can lead us to the most profound discoveries about ourselves. And so I walk on, into the wild, leaving behind the old me and embracing whatever lies ahead. Because sometimes, getting lost is the only way to truly find yourself. The first text message arrived at 3:17 a.m., jolting me awake with its cheerful ping. Bleary-eyed, I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, squinting at the sudden brightness of the screen. Unknown number. My thumb hovered over the delete button, assuming it was spam, when the content of the message made my blood run cold. "That blue looks good on you, Sarah. Sweet dreams." I bolted upright, suddenly wide awake, my heart pounding. How did this stranger know my name? And more disturbingly, how did they know I was wearing my favorite blue pajamas? I scanned my darkened bedroom, half expecting to see a face pressed against the window, but there was nothing, just the familiar shadows of my furniture and the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. Little did I know, this seemingly innocuous text was about to plunge me into a nightmare of surveillance and paranoia that would push me to the very edge of sanity. I've always been a private person. In this age of social media oversharing, I prided myself on maintaining a low online presence. No Facebook, no Instagram, just a bare-bones LinkedIn profile for work. My apartment was my sanctuary, a place where I could truly be myself without the prying eyes of the outside world, or so I thought. After that first text, sleep was impossible. I double-checked all my locks, peered out of every window, and even looked for hidden cameras, although I felt ridiculous doing so. By the time my alarm went off at 7 a.m., I had almost convinced myself it was just a bizarre coincidence. Maybe an old friend playing a prank, or a wrong number combined with a lucky guess. But then the second text came, just as I was sitting down to my morning coffee. "The Chinese takeout smells good. Enjoy your breakfast, Sarah." My mug slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. How? How could they possibly know? With shaking hands, I dialed the police. The officer who took my call was sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. Without any direct threats, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to block the number and document any further messages. I did as they suggested, but it made no difference. Throughout the day, texts kept coming from new unknown numbers. "You should water that plant by the window. It's looking a bit droopy. That client's logo design is coming along nicely. The red is a bold choice. Running low on milk, might want to pick some up on your way home." Each message sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Whoever this was, they weren't just guessing. They knew details about my life, my work, my home. They were watching me, somehow, from somewhere. I called in sick to work, unable to face the outside world. I drew all the curtains, unplugged every electronic device I owned, and sat in the middle of my living room, jumping at every small noise. By evening, I was a wreck. The texts had continued all day, commenting on my every move. I felt like a bug under a microscope, every action observed and noted by some unseen presence. In desperation, I called my best friend, Lisa. She arrived within the hour, armed with a bottle of wine and a determined expression. "Okay," she said, after I'd shown her the texts and explained the situation. "This is seriously creepy, but there has to be a logical explanation. Let's think this through." We spent hours going over every possibility: hacked devices, compromised Wi-Fi, a stalker with high-tech surveillance equipment. Each theory seemed more far-fetched than the last. As midnight approached, Lisa reluctantly had to leave. She offered to let me stay at her place, but some stubborn part of me refused to be driven from my own home. The moment she left, a new text arrived. "Your friend seems nice. Shame she couldn't stay longer." That was the final straw. I grabbed a bag and started shoving clothes into it, no longer caring about anything except getting out of there. But as I reached for the doorknob, my phone pinged again. "Running away won't help, Sarah. I'll always be with you." I froze, my hand on the doorknob. The words seemed to swim before my eyes. Always with you, always watching. In that moment, something in me snapped. If I couldn't escape this watcher, then I'd force them into the open. I marched back to the living room and stood in the center, arms outstretched. "All right," I shouted to the empty air. "You want to watch? Here I am. Come out and face me." Silence, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then slowly, a realization began to dawn on me. A terrible, impossible thought that I'd been subconsciously pushing away all day. With trembling fingers, I picked up my phone and opened the camera app. I switched to the front-facing camera and nearly dropped the phone in shock. There, reflected in the screen, was a face. But it wasn't my face. It was older, gaunt, with wild eyes and a twisted smile. As I watched in horror, the lips moved, forming words I could almost hear. I blinked, and the face was gone. Just my own terrified reflection staring back at me. But now I knew. The calls were coming from inside the house, as the old horror movie cliché went. But in this case, they were coming from inside my own mind. The next few days passed in a blur of doctors, appointments, psychological evaluations, and tearful conversations with worried friends and family. The diagnosis, when it came, was both a relief and a new kind of terror. Early onset schizophrenia, manifesting as delusions of being watched and auditory hallucinations in the form of text messages. The texts weren't real. They had never been real. It was all in my head. As I sit here now in the sterile quiet of the psychiatric ward, I'm still not sure what's real and what isn't. The doctors assure me that with medication and therapy, I can learn to manage my condition, that I can have a normal life. But a part of me wonders, what if they're wrong? What if the texts were real, and this is all an elaborate ruse to discredit me? What if the watcher is still out there, laughing at how easily they manipulated me into doubting my own sanity? I stare at my reflection in the window, searching for any sign of that other face. Sometimes, I think I see it, just at the edge of my vision, watching, waiting. My phone is gone, not allowed in here. But sometimes I swear I can hear it pinging. New messages, new observations, a constant commentary on my life. The rational part of my mind knows this is the illness talking, that I need to trust the doctors, trust the treatment. But another part, a part that grows louder in the quiet hours of the night, whispers that maybe, just maybe, I was right all along. And so I wait, caught between two realities. In one, I'm a woman battling a serious mental illness on the long road to recovery. In the other, I'm the victim of an unseen watcher, trapped in an elaborate game I don't understand. Which is true, I don't know. Maybe I never will. But one thing is certain. I'll never look at a text message the same way again. Because in this age of constant connectivity, the line between reality and delusion is thinner than we'd like to believe. And sometimes, the most terrifying truths are the ones we find within ourselves. As I drift off to sleep, my last coherent thought is a question that haunts me. If the watcher was all in my head, why do I still feel those eyes on me, even now? Sweet dreams, Sarah. I'll be watching.